Hello and welcome to the world premiere of the Ultimate Holistic Health Summit. Latest breakthroughs you haven't heard of. My name is Jason Prahl, and I'll be your host over the next 7 days, where you'll discover some of the most cutting-edge and effective healing tools from 35 of the most innovative and accomplished researchers, doctors, healers, and regenerative health experts on the planet. I want to take a moment to thank everybody involved for their tireless work that has gone into the production of this event, including the incredible speakers for donating their time and sharing their expertise. And I want to thank you for joining us and investing in your health and well-being. Now, let's dive right into the first interview with the amazing Deanna Hansen. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I am so excited to introduce you to my guest. Deanna Hansen is the founder of Fluid Isometrics and Block Therapy, a bodywork practice that is a therapy, exercise, and meditation all in one. Deanna's work benefits people of all ages and conditions. Focusing on the fascia system, her work teaches people to melt through the adhesions in scar tissue, ultimately awakening cells previously blocked from blood and oxygen. From those with debilitating issues to the elite athlete, this work can be modified to address any situation. Deanna has developed an online teacher training program, Block Therapy University, so people around the world can teach in their communities and empower others to become their own health advocates. Deanna, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure.
Well, as I was sort of gushing before we started, as soon as I was introduced to your work, and to be honest, it's like the most simple, basic thing to do. But as soon as I saw it and I understood what your objective was, I instantly recognized the genius of it. And as I experienced it, I recognized how badly I needed it and how this could be so widely applied to everybody. So block therapy is really what I want to talk to you about today. And let's just give people a very high level overview, because I saw some photos of some people that have used your therapy, and to be honest, it's mind blowing. You see these transformational things, and this is probably the most unbelievable side by side transformational pictures I've ever seen. So who's benefiting from this, and what are people seeing as a result?
Well, that's such a loaded question. It's so far-reaching, really. And what we really need to understand is the fascia system and how the fascia system is really here to support and protect our cells, essentially. And every cell in its perfect alignment has optimal space to receive blood and oxygen flow lifelong. And as long as cells are fed and clean, they're doing their job, they're not complaining, and they're happy doing it. What happens over time, though, is under the influence of gravity and unconscious posture and breathing, we literally wind down. We become shorter and wider. So the cells, they get taken away from their natural resting place. And the further that they are from their home, the less potential they have to allow our bodies to thrive. And what ultimately happens with the fascia, its goal is to maintain our uprightedness. So as I start tipping out of alignment over years, if I'm sitting in front of a computer or I'm standing on one leg because I'm dominant on one side, the fascia will grip to bone with a force up to 2,000 pounds per square inch to create stability within the body. So these adhesions that get developed over time, they block blood and oxygen flow to cells. And that's really what happens when we age. And people assume that aging is a process that we really have little control over. However, we really have ultimate control over how we age, because with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So as gravity is constantly pulling us down, the full conscious exhalation is that counter force to gravity. So what block therapy does is it targets the fascia system, but one of the main 3 pillars of block therapy is to access proper diaphragmatic breathing, because when we breathe diaphragmatically, we can feed the body up to 6 times the oxygen. And if you think of the brain, if we are lacking in oxygen for up to 5 minutes, we can die. And our cells are like little mini brains. So we want to ensure that each cell stays properly fed with oxygen lifelong, because the ATP in the cell, it's driven by oxygen. So if we're not breathing properly, and basically people stop breathing correctly because pain, fear, and stress over time cause us to reactively hold the breath, causing us to breathe through the muscles of the upper chest, the secondary muscles, which aren't really designed to feed the entire body oxygen. So we become depleted. And if you think of a balloon, when you blow it up fully, it's round, it glows, it almost defies gravity. take half the air out, it becomes wrinkled, it accumulates dust and debris in the creases, and it becomes heavy. And that's ultimately what happens to our cells as we age, as we start to become oxygen depleted. So we have the opportunity to change that and even reverse what the body's undergone up until whatever time people start diving into this process.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so important is the fascia is the system that, look, not a lot of people are talking about it unless you're in this sort of realm and you're digging deep into either the physiology of the body and how everything's working on the energetics level, or you're in some sort of movement practice, and even beyond that, you got to be diving deep in order to get into the importance of the fascia and how critical it is.
Yes.
And so, this is something that innervates the entire body, right? This is not just like this thing. I hear it often described as, because people want an image of it, is that when you look at a chicken wing or something and you see this sort of coating, and that's true, like that's the fascial connective tissue, but then we got to take that into literally every cell and nook and cranny in the body, right? And to be honest, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. This is a recent development in our understanding of the fascial system and all the connective tissue. In fact, recently the interstitium, which is kind of the fascial related networks, was actually classified as an organ for the first time, right? So this is all very new science. And I happen to believe that we're still going to learn a lot in the coming decades. So maybe you can kind of fill in some gaps where I missed about the interstitium and the fascia and this sort of network that's running throughout the body.
I was so happy a few months back to have had an interview with Gil Headley, an anatomist who's been diving into cadavers over, I think, probably 15, 20 years now. And I think it was way back in 2007 that I first saw the fuzz speech, which was so amazing because it really allowed me to send people to something visual and understand the adhesions and how they develop and how 2,000 pounds per square inch is a really intense force. So how over time this scar tissue can literally almost become like iron inside the body. So a few months back, I had an interview with him. And of course, he continues to dive in and learn more over the process. And so where he was at way back in 2007 compared to now, he's identified the perifascia. And that is the connective tissue regarding fascia that we address in block. And it is literally the fascia between every single one of the cells. I sort of see it personally like the cell membrane of every cell is the fascia connecting every other cell membrane of every cell in the body. So we're literally connected from head to toe, and it innervates nerve fibers, blood vessels, bone, skin, everything. It's not just a casing of the muscle.
And there's some really interesting, let's say, physics that go on with the fascia, right? There's this tension and it's a dynamic tension, and it's unbelievable what goes on in terms of the transference of electrical energy, the transference of what we call prana or chi, as well as the blood and the oxygen and the more physical side of the things. But there's so many fascinating things, and we can get into sort of the water science, and there's some interesting things going on with water and the connective tissue. So there's so much going on a biophysics level that
Yes.
to be honest, I don't know that we'll ever understand this system other than to sort of stand back and go, oh my God, this thing's totally amazing. Let's figure out how we can work with it, right? And that's really where your system thrives. And I remember seeing some of the photos, right? And you've got kids with scoliosis that are unbelievably, I wouldn't say perfect, but they're straightening out like in ways that you can't imagine. I've seen, what else? People just losing weight, right? So whether it's just this sort of water weight that's just being carried throughout the body and with a bunch of other things, as well as
the saddlebags.
the cellulite and and how cellulite sort of just disappears and melts away. So talk to me about this on the physical level. What's happening? How is your simple therapy, and we'll get into what it is, how is that able to correct some of these things? What's going on there?
So back to the water understanding, essentially, we aren't a solid being. We are a fluid being contained in this matrix. So like with water, there needs to be a certain temperature for optimal flow. And I live on the 13th floor over top of a river in Winnipeg. So I go from the extremes of freezing cold to summer, where of course we've got like a flowing river. And it's amazing to see the changes that occurs year after year. Just down the way, a few years back, a tree had fallen from the bank and it was blocking positive flow. So I could see the foam coming down the top of the river in a nice wave. And then it suddenly was getting accumulated to the underside in a spiral. And then you started to see chaos of this foam. And that's essentially what's happening in the body. So when we are diaphragmatic breathers, that's really the internal furnace of the body. And again, pain, fear, and stress cause us to reactively hold the breath. And two, if we're sitting negatively collapsed all the time, this plate of muscle that should be moving up and down in the body, it basically gets blocked. And now we have all these adhesions blocking that ability for that. So first of all, whenever we start block therapy, we always address the core and the rib cage, because the goal, of course, is to connect to that proper diaphragmatic breath. And when we do that, we turn on the body's internal furnace. Breathing through the upper chest muscles is like having a space heater. So in my 30-story building, if I have a space heater in my apartment, I'm not even heating my whole apartment. I'm literally heating one room. Where if you turn on the building's furnace, the entire building is heated. So because people aren't breathing properly, essentially their bodies have become cold, frozen, and brittle, just like Winnipeg in the winter. It's very dry. It's very cold. If you want to start your car, you have to heat it up, warm it up for about 30 minutes before you can go and drive. So we want a body that is always maintaining appropriate temperature from core to surface. So for example, when I first started this journey, I was 50 pounds overweight, and I was doing everything I possibly could to try to change my size and shape. And I would come home from a 5-mile run, dripping wet with sweat, but my belly would still feel cold. And then as this journey began for me through an anxiety attack that I was having, I intuitively dove my hand into my abdomen and started just moving my hand around in that space. And the first thing I encountered, besides the pain, was adhesion. Yet I hadn't had any injury or surgery specifically in that area. So as a body worker up to that point, I was very familiar with what scar tissue felt like in a body, but had never dove into that space in myself. So I'm thinking, wow, no wonder when I'm working out and I'm sweating, there's no blood flow getting to this tissue. It's still cold. It's literally frozen. So that was the very first aha moment I really had in the understanding of adhesion. Instead of scar tissue from injury and surgery, adhesion from unconscious posture over time as we fall out of alignment, because ultimately the fascia, in its ability to keep us upright, it creates false walls and false floors. So back to your cellulite question, if I'm not standing with proper foundation to support my cells in their proper alignment, I'm tipping off balance over time, the fascia winds and grips to bone. So it winds and grips because everything follows the pattern of energy in nature based on the Fibonacci sequence, which is the spiral pattern in nature. So there's no straight lines, there's nothing linear, everything winds, just like how I saw that foam winding. So as the fascia is gripping to bone, it creates these little dimples, which we see as cellulite. But more importantly, what those grips are doing is blocking blood and oxygen flow to cells on the other side, starving them as well, causing issues on the other side of what's going on. So through this process, we heat the body in 2 different ways at the same time. We lie on the tool, the block buddy. Now this is made of bamboo. And the reason it's made of bamboo is because bamboo and bone are similar in density. And if we want to be able to drive through the layers to the root of the issue at the bone, we can't use something porous like a foam roller. And we also don't roll or move on the surface. We sink in and we connect to the breath, and that turns on that internal furnace. So we're heating the body from inside, combined with pressure over time, which heats the body in that specific area on the outside. And then we very effectively can melt through the adhesions that have developed. And over time, we get to the root of the problem at the bone. So that's the first part, is the creating space that we do. The inflating space is all of the work that we do with the breath. And we really focus on the exhalation phase of the breath, because most people, when they talk about breathing, they take a nice full in breath, then they go, they don't move the waste out of the body first. And in 2014, they did a study in Australia that was shared in the medical news, proving that 84% of weight loss comes through proper exhalation. So for us to be able to truly connect to this phenomenal mechanism within the body, it feeds and cleans that space. And then the third part of block therapy is maintaining space. So we don't want to just fall back into that negative alignment that created the issues in the first place. We want to train proper alignment. And there's even the tongue muscle is one of the foundations that we teach people to strengthen, because it's not only for chewing and talking, it's also here to support the weight of the head, but people don't understand that. So if you don't know how to strengthen the tongue properly and align it, it becomes a hindrance to this space. So people that have a double chin, it's not really a double chin, it's a weak and displaced tongue. And then that will affect your thyroid, your carotid arteries, your major lymphatic drainage sites, as well as pull the neck out of alignment, which will create a wear of the cartilage and eventually arthritis and other issues. So it's really just, it is so simple because it's really just based on these three pillars: creating space, inflating that space, and maintaining the space.
It's amazing. I mean, I'd never heard of that about the tongue. So that, but it makes perfectly sense as you mention it. And one of the things that I really, as I mentioned, when I used your practice, what I instantly recognized, and the reason I loved it so much is because it's fundamentally using the breath and gravity. So in other words, you're just using nature's principles to do the work, really. And look, I'm of the fundamental belief that when we bring awareness into it, so we can actually focus our awareness, that adds another element of healing and sort of regulating and moving the energy too. But even just laying on this block when it was in my rib cage, abdomen area, and breathing, right, breathing in the right way and allowing sort of gravity to do the work, I could feel why I needed it so badly. We did it on our hamstrings. I really felt that as well. I could feel the areas of weakness or tightness or imbalance that really, really needed some work. And in that way, it's such a great teacher because we feel like, look, for the most part, we can feel fairly balanced, or we might think that we're a certain way, and then we use something like this, and it's a teacher in a totally different way. And so when we are using this breath, I like to think about this not as just oxygen too, right? This is literally prana. This is the breath of life. So there's something even deeper. There's a finer aspect of vitality itself that you're bringing into this equation, and you're directing it to these areas. And I think it's so critical to create that space, create that flow. And this is something that we see in children, right? Young children. They're so supple. I mean, I can take my kid and bend him any which way to Sunday, and it's amazing to watch, right? And we see that slowly dry up, tighten up, and lock up over time. And then you pointed to this other thing too, that when I was going through your training, which is the head, and this is a fascinating one, and the skin on your head, and why you want that to be movable and not so tight. And so I found myself playing with my little toupee up here, trying to like move it around, right? And so talk to me about that. Why is that important for the skin on our skull to be able to move around?
So as you mentioned, you think of taking a baby and taking that leg behind its head with ease. There's nothing in the way of that range of motion. What changes over time? The accumulation of gravity and those adhesions. So those adhesions, again, they are riddled throughout the entire body. As soon as we start tipping off balance, the fascia is going to grip. So here's this big globe that we have on the top of our body, and we start tipping away and tipping forward. And again, because the body wants to maintain its uprightedness, we get all these little hooks all throughout here. And if you see people, in fact, right now we're in the middle of our 21-day head, neck, and face challenge. I cannot wait to see these follow-up photos, to see the changes. And I'm already seeing them. It's amazing. But basically, if you look at people's faces when they're younger compared to when they get older, they get more narrow and pointed, because this is what's happening over time. As we start falling out of alignment, this is what occurs. So now think of the brain. I mean, we need space for the brain. We need space for the eyes. We need space for everything and for every cell. So as we age and the fascia keeps adding more adhesion, we keep creating blocks to flow. So one of the classes I have in my membership is the hair health class, and I get people to grab and pull the scalp away from the skull, hold for 3 minutes as you pull and search for pain. And then after you finish that class, you can feel the difference. You can feel that fluidity. And what's so amazing is one of my members, Gary Sharp, he has a site called Outthinking Parkinson's, and he had been doing block already for 2 years. And I think it was about 2 months ago that I put this hair health class in my membership. He did it for 3 weeks every single day. And he said, that has been the most impactful thing for his Parkinson's symptoms and the changes that have occurred in his body. So it's truly fascinating. But at the end of the day, it really all does come down to understanding that space, so that we can, as soon as there's a decrease in space, there is a cell that is under stress to try to receive what it needs and get rid of what it doesn't serve it. And so it becomes stagnant. And if you think of, say, if you're in LA and you're on the freeway and there's a huge traffic jam, it's not just the traffic, it's now the exhaust and all of the pollution that occurs from that, and it's stagnant. So that happens inside the body, which makes us acidic. And then it also creates more congestion and more clogging. So it really is all about making sure that we just have optimal flow. And pain is the guide, because pain equals adhesion. So we have this beautiful roadmap. We fell away from alignment, partly from gravity, but also partly from compensation. You know, if I'm a golfer, for example, and I have a sore shoulder and I really want to play, I'm just going to compensate. I'm going to move my body around so I can still play. I might not play as well, but I'm still going to play. Eventually, though, you don't have any more room to adapt. And then you have a frozen shoulder, for example. But we need to also understand that from head to toe, we go through these changes. So these adhesions develop as a result of pain. So we have this roadmap. And if we start going backward through time in our tissue, we literally take the time out.
Yeah, and what's coming up for me as you mentioned this is this complex dynamic and this is relationship between pain, movement, compensation, and this sort of cycle that continues, right? And I'm kind of at that age now. I'm just past 40, and all my athletics when I was younger, and I played baseball and football, and I'm right-handed, so every motion was twisting one way with really, really amazing torque, right? And then having to sort of slow all that down. And so there's a lot of imbalances that have accumulated over time. And of course, as you mentioned, I compensate. And the compensation can keep up for a while until pain, then more pain comes in. And then as the pain comes in, I compensate further, and on we go. And to the point, I think that eventually most of us, when we start getting to some age, we stop moving as much, right?
Yeah.
And this is what we talk about in the sort of the longevity space, which is how important movement is. And it doesn't mean that we're out running marathons when we're 72. It just means walking, right? And of course, walking has its own posture and proper function and movement. And as we distort and as we create these imbalances, now we're, especially when we're talking about CrossFit and some of these other exercises that we do, we start loading up this dysfunction, and we're just creating more issues, right? And so it's a very interesting dynamic. And there's some really cool technologies coming out. Nerve hydrodissection is one of these that actually is really similar to what you do. It's just super high tech, where they get in there and they start to separate the nerves. And that's what some pain, not all pain, but a lot of pain can be just a nerve trapped in this sort of adhesion, this scar tissue. And instead of sliding, right, and being mobile, the nerve just gets pinched. And then every time you move, that's what creates the pain. And so they go in there with this nerve hydrodissection. They put a little fluid in there, loosens it up, and now we got fluid movement again. We just removed that the nerve from that fascial plane, and it's brilliant. But that's really expensive, and it's very specialized too. So you can even get, the level of expertise can vary from practitioner to practitioner. Your method,
and not only
actually,
that, but when you have a modality that is doing something like that to you, you're not training the breath, you're not training proper alignment. So if I'm sitting like this and I have a pinch and I get that, I might have a temporary improvement. We want to get to the root of things. We truly want to correct things. And that's another thing that we really teach with block therapy is there's cause sites and pain sites. And your comment about walking, the calves and the feet are truly the most profound cause sites for everything up the chain, including migraines, how we age, because they are the furthest from the engine. So that is where the fascia is the most frozen. And I do assessments all the time where I see what's going on in the body, and people think something like scoliosis is a function of the spine. It's really a condition of the limbs and how the limbs torque the spine. So if we just address the spine, again, as soon as you start walking, you're going to get pulled back into that fascia pattern that created the issue in the first place. So to get to those cause sites is key. And that's part of what block therapy is all about.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, and because that's what those technologies are great, but ultimately they're addressing a symptom, right? They're addressing the end cause, but ultimately it's not fixing what caused that. You're not recreating that balance in that space that is so important, right? So I think over time you're just going to continue to run into issues and keep trying to address those same symptoms that are popping up.
Absolutely.
And one thing you mentioned is the removal of waste, right? And a lot of the work that I do has to do with get into Ayurveda. We get into the the lymphatic system and lymph drainage, right? And we do things like oil massage, and we can actually massage where a lot of the lymph nodes are. We can use dry brushing, and we can use a lot of oil to help lubricate all those layers. But at the end of the day, if we still have these adhesions, that's going to create a lot of issues when it comes to the transference of those toxins, of that metabolic waste, of all the things that need to be moved out of the body. They can't get from that interstitium to into the lymph system and
Right.
then out, right? So I think it's interesting because we do focus on the lymphatics, and that's great to get the lymph flowing. But if things aren't getting into the lymph, then we have a problem. We have a backup going on, and I think this is why we have a lot of the sort of toxic aspects building up in the body that starts to show up in appearance. And as we start to move that stuff out, this is why I think we see so much weight loss and amazing body changes in certain detoxification programs, because that stuff finally is moving out of the body. And I think your system addresses that in a profound way that I haven't really seen in a lot of other therapies.
And it really is about engaging that pump, that full exhalation. And if we can't release the diaphragm to exhale fully, we can strengthen what we have. It was great. My brother-in-law years ago, he said, what's the difference between doing a yoga class or a hamstring stretch and blocking the hamstring? And this was a great question, because if you had a towel, for example, and you tied it in a knot, that's going to be like the typical person. And then you have the opportunity to stretch this towel with the knot in the center to the level that you can. With what we're doing with block therapy, we're untying that knot so that we have more length to lengthen with stretching. So it's interesting because it's completely different than the concept of stretching. Stretching alone is not going to release those adhesions that have shortened and locked everything on the bone. With block therapy, through the process of understanding magnetics, that's how we create those releases, because the body is electromagnetic. And imagine, for example, if I had space between my left lower ribs and my hip joint, but let's say for 20 years, I sit like this in front of a computer, I'm collapsed. So now this space has dramatically shortened, and this has created a magnetic love, kind of like trying to separate two teenagers in love. It's very hard to do. Now, if you had two magnets far enough apart, they don't have any power over each other. Get them close enough together and they seal with a force. Try to separate them, very hard to do, but you can do this and they'll glide apart. And that's the key. It's through the process of when you're on the tool, how you're guided to search for pain and twist into those deeper layers so that we can actually release those magnetics. And then you pump oxygen into that space and you actually create space. So you start pulling that connection further away. And then through, again, that understanding of now let's support proper alignment and change posture, you maintain the space so you don't fall back in.
I love that. And so we can address things like chronic pain. And this is the thing too with joint pain, right? This is a difficult one because joints don't get blood flow like we would typically get in other areas. It requires synovial fluid, and movement actually is required to get things in and out, right? And so with your therapy, we can actually start to remove those adhesions, remove that pain oftentimes that's preventing us from creating that consistent movement that's actually pumping things in and out of that joint, right? So there's a lot there just on the joint alone. Go ahead and speak to
And we
that.
can do it lying down too. So I mean, think of somebody with an arthritic knee and and they're overweight, and then the doctor is saying, go, you have to start walking, you have to start moving. But every time you take a step, that knee is really sore. We do this work lying down. You can do it on a bed, you can do it on the floor. And through that process of melting adhesions from the core to that site, we start pumping that blood flow in. And we have had people cancel knee replacements because the body will rebuild. People say or use the term necrotic tissue, which essentially means dead tissue. I don't believe there's any dead tissue in a living body. There's just tissue blocked from life. So with this process, we melt through those blocks.
Well, and we're seeing this a lot in sort of the stem cell market and the PRPs and the prolotherapies, and I don't mean using fetal stem cells, even though those are amazing to use. A lot of times in the US, we have to use our own stem cells, and we're still seeing amazing results from, even as we get older, we can still see results. So that's showing me that the vitality is there, the life force is there. It's just got to get to the tissue. So how do we get these stem cells? How do we get these things that want to get in there and do the healing work? How do we get them there, right? And this is the important factor.
Absolutely.
So we have things like chronic pain. skin issues, right?
Mhm.
Imbalances in the structure, thyroid issues, fatigue. I mean, you could probably go on and on, liver issues, kidney issues, because you actually get in there into these internal organs and you start to massage and remove the adhesions, create the space, increase the oxygenation. I mean, it's really hard to imagine a chronic condition that this won't help.
And I have yet to see one. And like, let's talk just something about like fatty liver disease, for example. So we have this massive organ right here. And if you think of butter at room temperature, it's a solid. Put it in the frying pan and you heat it, it becomes a liquid. So fatty liver disease, in my opinion, is so on the rise because everyone's collapsed. Nobody's breathing from here. And when we are using that muscle, that diaphragm, it's creating an internal massage to these organs 24/7. When you fall out of alignment and you start breathing up here, you actually displace the organs, and now you don't have that activity inside the body. So the organs themselves, they start to cool down. And now we're breathing up through here. So when we're blocking, for example, one of the positions that we do, and there's many ways we approach it, is we lie right on the liver. We'll put the block right through here. And when you combine that pressure over time with that movement of the diaphragm, you're creating that frying pan getting warmer. And now those fats start to melt and they get out of the way of the liver. So now the liver can improve its function. Same thing when we're eating, the stomach organ on the opposite side. It's interesting because so many people have digestive issues and people aren't breathing properly. So they're not getting that added activity to help the digestion process, but they're also not chewing properly. So people are swallowing whole chunks of food because everyone's in a rush or, having dinner with family. I mean, it's a lovely concept, but really eating should be the singular thing that you do. You shouldn't be eating and talking because you can't do both things well. So, I mean, I've been there where you're having spinach and you're talking to somebody and then you get self-conscious. So you gulp the food back. But now we've missed that first breakdown process in the mouth. We should be swallowing liquid, not solids. And then you're also not activating that additional heating mechanism through breathing while eating. And most people, again, are collapsed and just unconscious. So the stomach organ is being pummeled. So no wonder it can't break down the food and create proper absorption. So everybody has these issues. And then, of course, this food not broken down, it's not eliminating effectively either because we have adhesions all throughout the intestines, blocking proper elimination. Now we attract parasites and other negative things inside, and they have waste. And so you can imagine why the entire world is ballooning because really it comes down to them not learning how to breathe properly.
Yeah, and just on a nervous system level, right? When it comes to chronic conditions, we talk a lot about parasympathetic and sympathetic, right? And if we've
Yeah.
got all these adhesions, we've got all this, let's just say, stored stress and trauma even in the body, then that's going to basically tip over into the sympathetic on a consistent basis. So we're running the sympathetic internally because of the way that our body's structured and these adhesions and the lack of flow, the lack of rest essentially in the body. Then we're going to be dominating in that sympathetic. And so trying to sort of activate this parasympathetic, meanwhile, you're working against what's going on in the body and what's being held in the body. So as we can loosen that up, let go of some of that sympathetic drive, then we can actually naturally rest in the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest and the sex and all the good things we want in life basically happen in the parasympathetic when we are resting, and that's when they flow, right? So a big part of healing chronic issues is actually lowering that sympathetic drive, upregulating that parasympathetic tone, and things naturally start to move.
Yeah. And like with trauma, for example, like if say 20 years ago, I experienced a horrible event, pain, fear, and stress cause us to reactively hold the breath. So now I've held that trauma in my breathing pattern. And if you look at an animal that, say, a deer that escapes a kill, they shake after, they release that energy where we freeze. So we keep that energy inside, and then the breath breathes from there. And that's where you see a lot of people with fibromyalgia, for example, because it often happens after an injury or a traumatic event. So those emotions also get trapped and stored. And then because it's all about magnetics, we start accumulating and attracting more of that emotion that is getting built up within the body. And then that changes the pattern of how we think. It's an Eckhart Tolle that says when we're breathing diaphragmatically, we're connected to a relaxed brain pattern, which is where God lives in the moment. When we're breathing through the muscles of the upper chest, it's a different brain pattern. It's a stress pattern, which connects us to the ego, thoughts of future and past, which aren't real. So people get caught up in these stories because, again, they're breathing from this wrong place. So those traumas, as we start opening up the fascia and breathing that energy out of the body, people have these beautiful healing crises where suddenly they're letting go of what had happened. They might have dreams come up or memories surface or emotions pouring out of them, but that's all part of it. It's the body releasing. So it's not just the physical stuff that the body releases, it's also those emotions that have been stored and trapped in the breath.
Absolutely, and that's something that I was introduced to primarily through rolfing. Is that I could actually, so emotional processes would move or energies would move, and I can feel that in the subtle body as I was going through some of these rolfing. And rolfing, for those who aren't familiar, is kind of working the fascia, manual manipulation of the sort of fascial networks in a little bit different a way. And in my opinion, doesn't quite get as deep into some of these tissues that your method does, but nevertheless, it would still release some of these traumas. So as we get into
Yes.
some of this stuff, these energies that are held within the actual physical tissues of the body, and especially since your method gets down to the bone, they can actually be released on deep levels. And this is where we may or may not recognize what's actually being released, but fundamentally, energetically, a lot is changing in that process. And so I just want to you've described it pretty well so far, but I want to give people a sense for what I experienced when I tried your method. So you showed the block, and you put it in different areas, and you use gravity, so you're laying on it typically, and the motion or the alignment that you're set in is directed by you. You've got a lot of great cues to put people in and where to put the block and how to position your body. But ultimately, you're using gravity to sit or lay on this block, and it can be on your side, on your back, and your stomach, and your hamstrings, and your calves. You get all these different positions, and breathing into that. And as you breathe into that, you're going deep into the tissues, and as you expand out, you're sort of moving things and creating space, right? And so there's this constant compression. And what I found is that for me, I found myself looking for the pain points as indications of where the adhesions are and where to focus sort of the position of the block, and these sort of minor adjustments, and say, oh, there's the spot, there it is, that's what we need to work on. And in some ways, it's not comfortable. And in fact, that's kind of the cue to some degree, right? It's this discomfort, and like, there's the discomfort. Okay, there we go. And it's what I found though is it started off really uncomfortable, and then it would get, okay, this is actually manageable. I'm gaining some movement, and actually in the moment, you can actually feel some separation and some space being created. That was what was so profound to me. It wasn't like, okay, I need to do this for 6 weeks before I start to notice something.
Yeah,
It was like
right
3
away.
or 4 breaths. I was starting to notice, oh, it's opening. Wow. I can only imagine if I keep going, what's going to be created.
And what's so lovely is we teach you to be in control because, of course, this is self-care. So the rule is your breath is your guide. As long as you're breathing in a relaxed way, you're feeding and healing the cells. If something hurts so much that it's stopping that relaxed breath, then this isn't going to serve you. So then we instruct you, if you're on the floor, go on the bed. The bed is less intense. If the bed is too intense, you can adjust. You can use props or pillows. And that is really the key. It puts the power into the person's hands so that they can administer as much pain or pressure as their body feels with their breath. And what's neat is the pressure fibers are larger in diameter than the pain fibers.
Mm.
So once you get into position and you connect to that breath, that's when the pain starts to change. It's the same concept
Ah,
really as a TENS machine. You know, those TENS machines, to control pain, they create a stimulation. So there's an override of pain. So as you sink in and you give yourself those breaths, then you can start going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I really observed this before block therapy when I was working on my patients. And I would have many people come in and they'd be so afraid of pressure, so afraid of pain. And so I would always start with very light touch for these people. And then I would just have them breathing. And before they even knew it, within a couple minutes, I was going as deeply into their body as I would anybody else because they were in that relaxed state and they didn't even realize what was happening because there's this natural, again, we're connecting to the parasympathetic nervous system. So the body is getting out of that tension, scared mode, and it's letting go and it's relaxing. And then we can dive deeper and then we can search for those deeper adhesions. And we just keep going layer through layer through layer till we get to the root.
beautiful. Deanna, this has been great. I think we can go on forever. I love what you do. I feel like I could learn so much from your wisdom of the body. You've truly drove in some new ways, and I really appreciate everything you're doing. So please tell people where they can find more of your work.
Blocktherapy.com.
Easy enough. And just like
Yeah.
that, the therapy is simple. The cues are simple, but the method is profound. I mean, I can't say it enough, and I think it's worth everybody trying, especially since it can be done from anywhere. And you can take that block. You can even use towels, right? You give some
Yeah.
cues and indications of how to roll up a towel and use that, and that's just as effective in many ways for certain areas. I've had some really sensitive. My hamstring was actually needed a towel. I couldn't do the block because it was too much. So it's amazing work, and I thank you again for everything that you do.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
Before we dive into the next interview, if you haven't already, please do us a favor and share this event with your friends and family and on social media so that these revolutionary techniques and healing modalities can reach as many people as possible. You just never know whose life you might change by sharing these cutting-edge presentations. My next guest is someone I recently met and was blown away by with his approach to addressing complex mind-body health challenges. Ashok Gupta is an internationally renowned speaker, filmmaker, and health practitioner who has dedicated his life to supporting people through chronic illness and achieving their potential. Ashok suffered from what is known as ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, around 25 years ago when he was studying at Cambridge University. Through neurological research that he conducted, he managed to get himself 100% better. He then set up a clinic to help treat others, and then in 2007, he published the well-known neuroplasticity limbic retraining recovery program known as the Gupta program. He has published several medical papers and is continually researching these conditions. You can find more information at www.guptaprogram.com. Ashok, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Jason. A pleasure to be here.
So take me back to you're studying at Cambridge University. First of all, what were you studying there when you were at university?
Well, funny enough, people ask me that, and I was actually studying economics rather than anything kind of science related. Although what I say to people is, interestingly, economics is very psychological, and the cycles that you get in economics are very similar to the cycles you get in the brain and in the body. So I think I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, I'm very similar. I studied engineering, and people are like, well, that's a very weird jump for you to make from engineering to health. And then, when I explain the fact that it's systems thinking and it's the big puzzle, then it all of a sudden starts to make a little bit of sense too. So when you were there at university studying economics, doing your thing, you've got a clear direction probably of where you're going in life, and then you get rocked by ME, by chronic fatigue syndrome. And it's known as a syndrome because we can't really get a grip on it from the medical perspective. This traditional medical paradigm around chronic fatigue is that it's just a bunch of symptoms. We don't really know where they're coming from. We don't really know what's causing it, and we don't really know what to do about it, so we're going to try a bunch of stuff. And this is even the case in integrative and functional medicine. There's still a lack of true understanding of what is this. And I think there's a lot of theories, and there's a lot of people that have ideas. I think it becomes more compelling when it comes from somebody like you who had to deal with it themselves, right? They understand what it is experientially, and they're having to take themselves out of it. And even though there may not be one specific way to treat this thing, so to speak, for every single person, there's a fundamental understanding of what chronic fatigue is. So I'm just kind of curious, as you were going through this chronic fatigue, what did you learn about, and by the way, I should set the stage here because the Gupta program, although really, really effective for addressing chronic fatigue, mental, emotional challenges, mind-body things, it's kind of a program that because it's working at the neurological level, on the brain level, can address just about every condition that's out there in one way or another. So I just want to set that stage. And so as you're going through this chronic fatigue sort of mess, different kind of education, a different kind of university, what did you kind of learn along the way?
Yeah, definitely. It was the education, the University of Life in that moment that was teaching me a lot of things. And, as you say, there are so many modern conditions, things like long COVID now and fibromyalgia and pain syndromes, even things like Alzheimer's, where a lot of people are using our program, these neuroplasticity approaches. And when I was unwell, what was really crazy was that I went from doctor to doctor, and they had no idea what the cause was. They'd say, look, you've got depression, take these antidepressants, which would make me feel much worse. And they said, we don't know what this is. You might have this forever. Like a brick wall in front of a young man. I literally felt suicidal in those moments, thinking, well, what's the point? What's the point of life here? And hitting that real, as they say often with us in this field, it's only when you hit your absolute rock bottom, your absolute low, that transformation really occurs. And I picked myself up and I said, you know what, I want to figure out what's causing this. And because I met hundreds of people with similar conditions, I realized there's so much suffering around the world. And I made a promise to the universe. And I said, if I can figure this out, if I can get myself well, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with these conditions. And that started me on a journey, a quest, because I just cannot take no for an answer. I said, I want to figure this out. They cannot just say there's no explanation. So I read a lot of brain neurology, especially the work of Professor Joseph Ledoux, who's one of the foremost experts in the amygdala and the limbic system part of the brain. And I also studied neurology. I studied chronic fatigue itself. And I came up with a hypothesis as to what I thought caused the condition.
Real quick, I want to interrupt here because this is important. I want to give people a sense for what we're talking about, because it's one thing to go research a topic, but when you have chronic fatigue and you're trying to go research a bunch of stuff, it's kind of difficult, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would pick up a textbook and I couldn't even read the words. Sometimes I wouldn't even know what I've just read. And so, yeah, absolutely. It was a very tricky thing to try and say, well, I need to understand this. But, necessity is the mother of all invention. I just had to figure this out. Otherwise, I couldn't move forward with anything in my life. And that was really challenging and especially an area that I wasn't familiar with, brain neurology. And you can't get heavier than that. Apart from maybe rocket science. Totally. So, I really had to work hard at trying to understand what was going on. And I started figuring out some mechanisms, which, as I said, reminded me of some of the mechanisms I'd studied in economics, and thought, actually, this has been applied traditionally to psychological conditions. But because medicine traditionally separates psychology and physiology, you go to a hospital and there are separate departments in a hospital, which is crazy. Maybe if we apply some of this same neurology to a physical condition, could we come out with similar outcomes? So I started experimenting with the periphery of my consciousness, and probably some of the first brain retraining in this area that was ever done, trying to experiment. How could I retrain my brain out of these responses that I could recognize? And we're definitely not saying these conditions are psychological, but we're saying in the unconscious brain, as it were. And I managed to start noticing that I could start improving my condition with this set of systems or these hypotheses. And I got myself better and better and better, researched more and more and more, got myself 100% better.
And what does that look like? You said getting better. What does that look like in the practical, right? So you're starting to get more energy, you're sleeping better, you can focus more. Like, what's the general what was the progression? How did you notice that?
So I think for me, it was all of those different things. So the physical symptoms improving, so more energy and, the ability to walk further, not necessarily exercise straight away, but walk further. Then mentally, more cognitive faculties coming back, so concentration and memory. Then emotionally, not feeling so pulled down by this condition, but being able to actually be uplifted on certain days.
Yeah.
And then spiritually, regaining my enthusiasm for life. All of these things at all four levels beginning to come back, step by step. And then once I got to 90%, the final 10%, and this happens with many of our patients, is almost rehabilitating yourself back into normal life in terms of, okay, when stress starts coming back, when you start working on things, how can your system stay centered and calm? Because we want people to get well, but also stay well. And yourself, in this area, I'm sure you've noticed, there are many people who come to your clinic and they will get well from your treatments, but the moment a stressful situation comes back in their lives, wham, the whole physiology goes out of whack and the symptoms come back.
Right.
So it was all about how do you manage your lifestyle going forward? And so I think I got to the 90% stage, and then the final 10% was a little slower as I rehabilitated myself back into the normal day-to-days of life, introducing food groups and things like that. And that started me on a journey and a quest to say, right, I've got myself better. I want to publish in this area. So I managed to publish a paper in Medical Hypotheses Journal in 2002. It was published online in 1999 and then in the journal in 2002. And then I set up a clinic to treat other people with this condition. And we noticed that not only was it chronic fatigue and ME, but then pain syndromes, and then unexplained sensitivity reactions. So mold illness, people started finding improvement, allergies, sensitivities, food sensitivities. And I started thinking, this is really interesting. The programming of the brain that makes us react to our environment, creating illness within, that can be changed. And that's, incredibly empowering. And that really then propelled me on to publishing the first neuroplasticity program in 2007 online. And since then, we've done further studies and published further in the area.
Yeah, I love this. And it actually takes me back to a lot of my education in sort of trauma therapy and what trauma is, and conditioning from early life childhood, and even to sort of some of the Buddhist teachings that show up in things like Vipassana, right? Which is this idea that when a stimulus happens in the environment, there's actually a body response first. Then there's a recognition in the mind, so to speak. In other words, it's subconscious before it's conscious. Yes. The body is already, the neurology is already firing. It's already, because it's wired in such a way. And so it's triggered without us even thinking about the reaction. And that's why it's so hard from a willpower perspective to refrain from these natural reactions, right? I mean, you think about somebody jumping out in front of you, and your body just reacts before you even have an understanding what this thing is, right? So that's happening all the time with every stimulus, until we get a deeper, in other words, we can close that gap between subconscious and conscious, right? And then we, as you're sort of pointing out here, is that we can rewire that subconscious pattern. We can rewire that, and that becomes so powerful. Now we can respond to the world in a new way. And so, I mean, this is true empowerment. And so the fact that you were able to really design a program to be able to facilitate that, I think is truly amazing. So how did that really come into play? I mean, because look, it's one thing, I do a lot of research, right? And when I say research, I mean, I read a lot of papers and I connect dots and I think about things, and, I talk to a lot of people and these type of things. So it's one thing to sort of figure out the puzzle mentally. It's another thing to take what you think you know, or the research on paper, and then to try to create something new or formulate your own idea and then put that into action. So how was that? How did you kind of gain that confidence that what you think you were learning is truly going to be applicable to a wide range of people?
Yeah, good question. And I think for me, as you mentioned, these kind of Buddhist principles or Eastern principles, I think for me, it was about humility to say, actually, I can't say right now that I've got the perfect answer, but let me experiment and test and experiment and test and keep learning and keep learning. And I try to do that in all aspects of my life. Continue to be a student, continue to learn. And I think that's the most important thing, because you can grab onto an idea and think, right, it's this one idea, I keep pursuing it and everything else is wrong. And it's about continually learning. So I think for me, that was important. And as I started noticing with my clients, okay, this works, this doesn't work. Okay, the next client, this works, this doesn't work. Right, generally for the vast majority of people, what are the core patterns that are working? So it was really evidence-based for me in terms of what was working with my patients, and then saying, right, here's a protocol that we keep coming back to, and then publishing that.
Got it. So how do we get into these situations? How do we get so into this sort of chronic fatigue? How do we get into sort of these neurological patterns? What is I don't want to say the cause, because there's a bunch of contributors, but what are those contributors that you've noticed that really set up the conditions through which something like ME or chronic fatigue and some of these other conditions can arise?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to take you through the hypothesis. So essentially, the way I look at it, we start from first base principles in science, or certainly in biology, to say, why are we here? Right now, we you and I have a lot of banter around a kind of Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy, so we could talk about that question for years, if in fact. But let's talk from a biological perspective. We're here because this body, this nervous system, over millions of years has evolved from plants to invertebrates, vertebrates, reptiles, mammals, human beings. Right, it's designed to adapt to our environment, survive, pass on our genes to the next generation through reproduction. Yeah, so there's a whole biological principle there of survival of this body, this system. And it is finely tuned to survive many, many different things. Yeah. Now, suddenly, the last 200 to 300 years, the way that we live is completely different than our traditional biology. Ironically, we're living longer than we ever have before. but because of modern healthcare, but at the same time, we are introducing a lot of triggers and a lot of stimuli that weren't there in our past. Now, those stimuli, mainly, there's lots of areas, but one is chemical. So we're exposed to more pollutants, more chemicals. Yeah, we're exposed, I believe, to more psychological stress at a deeper level than we were before, because before the village would bring up the child. Now we're nuclear families, huge amount of stress, huge amount of pressure, social media, etc. We don't need to go into all of that. So we've got more biological threats, we've got more emotional threats, and we've actually seen, because of increases in population, more actual immune threats as well, in terms of there's more viruses and bacteria now spreading amongst the populations because of international travel, as an example. So suddenly this refined system that ensures survival is being hit by lots of threats. And that means that over the last couple of 100 years, we've developed what I call a pro-inflammatory bias. So our system is more inflamed in the background more of the time. And that is contributing to this kind of background fatigue, this background tiredness, pain, etc. But that's all in the background in the general population. In these conditions, what I believe happens, not only is the system more prone to inflammation, but suddenly a traumatic event causes a response of overinflammation and continual overinflammation. So I'd love to give the example of COVID and long COVID, because that's very much in the news right now. And millions of people around the world getting long COVID, and we're seeing a lot of those patients in our clinic. So we believe there are 3 risk factors. So the first risk factor is genetic. So there may be some genetic component, and we certainly see that in mold illness. The second component is chronic or acute stress. Now, so many people find in these conditions, in the run-up, perhaps 6 months to a year, in the run-up to getting a condition, they've had a lot of stress. And we even see that in cancer as well. In cancer, there are patterns of chronic stress which lead up to the immune system being compromised.
And this is pretty common, right? With most illnesses, is that even the chronic ones that we see, there's usually some acute thing that sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? But as you mentioned, the sort of the chronic situation's been there, the inflammation's been there, the imbalances have been there for a while, and then boom, something takes you down, seemingly all of a sudden, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of that chronic and acute stress, we think of emotional stress, but it can be physical stress. So we treat a lot of people with athletes overtraining syndrome, where they've pushed their bodies too hard. And in that regard, we call it the bucket hypothesis, where you imagine a bucket, which is your ability to handle stress. It gets filled with mental, emotional, biological threats, reaches a top, and when it spills over, it means your body can no longer handle this anymore and goes into survival mode and causes these kind of reactions. Then the third trigger is some kind of physical trigger. So in the situation of long COVID, it would be the COVID-19 infection. Yeah. So we've got those triggers, and they come together and create a conditioning effect in the brain. Now, when I say conditioning, basically your brain learns to do something new. It gets a new habit, a new reaction, a new trauma, as it were. And we believe this happens in 2 brain structures, one called the amygdala and one called the insula. And we'll come back to those in a moment. And from that moment onwards, in the case of COVID, we know that the brain realizes that COVID is life-threatening. And in fact, the people who pass away from COVID is because it's not from the COVID itself, but it's often the over-inflammation of the lungs. It's the cytokine storm where the own immune system is over-responding. So there's precedent for this. That even once the body has fought off the COVID-19 infection, the brain thinks, I only just managed to overcome that. And survival is our number 1 priority. So anything that seems similar to COVID-19, or if we suspect the infection is still in the body, will continue to trigger the immune system and the nervous system. So those 2 main systems. That then causes symptoms in the body, which then feed back to a hypersensitive brain, and we get caught in a vicious cycle of reaction. And actually, Jason, if it's useful, I might just share a slide just to show this visually. So I think this will really kind of help people get a flavor for this. So if we take this as our main trigger, so our predisposing factors, which may be genetic, also upbringing at number 1. So adverse childhood experiences, trauma, abuse can predefine our system to be ready to overreact. Yeah, and we know people with adverse childhood experiences have 3 or 4 times more likelihood of chronic illness later in life. Then on second, acute and chronic stress, viral, bacterial are the trigger. In the case of mold illness, exposure to mold, etc. And that then causes this vicious cycle where at number 4, the brain becomes traumatized by it. At number 5, it creates a chronic sympathetic arousal, immune dysfunction, many HPA abnormalities, so that's hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal gland abnormalities, which shows up as adrenal fatigue, but is in fact not adrenal fatigue. Causing at number 6, the symptoms. So we know that a lot of these syndromes have very similar symptoms of muscle pain and dysfunction, cognitive difficulty, sleep issues, autonomic dysfunction, difficulty exercising, irritable bowel, bowel inflammation, swollen glands, etc. And at number 7, we also see secondary conditions like mitochondrial dysfunction, latent virus reactivation, and allergies and sensitivities, which are very common in the population, but suddenly skyrocket when someone has this particular conditioned learning in the brain. This then cycles back at number 8 to a hypersensitive brain that says, oh no, this is evidence of ongoing infection. Therefore, we must trigger the immune system and nervous system again, and we create a cycle. And what's really fascinating, and Jason, systems thinking and engineering, which you're so au fait with, cycles are created when there are feedback loops. So in these illnesses, people have up days, down days, up days, down days. Now, if you break your leg is broken 7 days out of 7 days. But in these conditions, people have good days, bad days, which indicates a feedback loop that's occurring between the brain and the body. And we call this the game of tennis between the brain and the body, firing each other up and getting stuck in their own loops. And that's why someone can go on holiday and sit on a beach, but they're still in a state of chronic illness, because this is a function of the body that's gone wrong, essentially.
Yeah, I love this, and this is exactly. I think when I first heard you talk about all the things that you were studying and researching and teaching, it really married up with the things that I've come to know as well. And it's this idea that the brain body can get stuck, right? It gets locked into a pattern, and there needs to be something that interrupts that pattern for a sort of new pathway to be created, or even perhaps even a really old one that was never really defined very well. But this is what I found as well. It's like it gets stuck, it gets caught, right? And for a very good reason. There's a real need by the brain, the body, the nervous system to respond in such a manner, and yet it gets so ingrained, so caught that it can be difficult or challenging. We got to throw a monkey wrench in there to really disrupt that, right? And I've seen this with even my own health. Again, I'll go back to Vipassana because it's such an interesting sort of experiment of 10 days, no talking, meditating 12 hours a day, no exercise, no reading, not doing anything other than meditating, sleeping, and walking around, and a little bit of food. And in that 10 days, my inflammation just dramatically reduced. Everything started to sort of become a little bit more soft, in tune, and this was simply because my whole system was calming down, right? And again, it's a perfect example of this sort of mind-body stimuli sort of feedback loop that I was totally removing almost all stimuli, right? And I was going inward for 12 plus hours a day. I was sleeping for 6 to 7. So there was only 4 or 5 hours a day I was actually awake. And of those waking hours, I was eating a couple of those hours. I was sitting there drinking tea, and then I was walking. There's just not a lot of stimuli, right? So I was shutting down all those things. My system was able to finally sort of, even though that loop was still there, we quieted the noise and we really brought that down, right? And so when I went back into the world, things started charging up again, right? So that was it was a brilliant case of exactly what you're describing, which is that, look, when we're sleeping, things are really good, right? Like all the symptoms quiet down when we actually go to sleep, right? When we shut off the stimuli, when we get out of these cycles, these loops, it's okay. But then they kick right back on. So the question that of course you came up with and you answered, how do we break that loop? How do we get in there, disrupt that, and create a new pattern?
Yeah, absolutely. And firstly, just to comment on what you were saying, the meditation is absolutely brilliant, and we prescribe that as well at calming down the whole system. But as you say, specific neuronal networks and pathways, the Sanskrit word being vasana, those specific vasanas or those specific loops, they're so deeply embedded that the moment something new comes along, those protective responses occur. And so the way to look at these illnesses is there's nothing actually going wrong. It's an overprotective evolutionary response that's supposed to be good for us, but it's just decided to overprotect. And because in medical profession we separate psychology and physiology and the immune system, this is why modern medicine has a lot of difficulty in treating these conditions, because actually the brain makes no differentiation. And traditionally, the amygdala was associated with trauma and psychology. Now they're finding the amygdala associated with pain gateways. It's associated with the immune system and the insula as well. So all these brain structures, you realize that these things get coupled together. So stress and immune function get coupled together because those were the defining moments at the beginning of the condition. And this is just, it's really fascinating because I believe 70 to 80% of the conditions that someone sees a doctor for, so pain syndromes, skin conditions, allergies, sensitivities, depression, even anxiety, all of these are as a result of not the physical hardware going wrong, but the software going wrong. These are software problems. And medicine is brilliant at treating hardware problems, but not so good at treating the software problems, the software bugs. So there's a whole new area of medicine, neuroplasticity, bioelectrical medicine, that I think is going to really be the next big thing that's going to treat a whole range of these conditions that people see doctors for.
Well, and I don't disagree with you at all. In fact, I will take your sort of statement maybe even a bit further, which is that software problem goes down, and maybe this is what you mean, but for me, I think about the software going down to the cellular level. In other words, there's nothing wrong with the nucleus. There's nothing wrong with the well, there can be some damage, no question. But what's happening is that we're losing communication at that level. So damage can occur in the body. The body has a mechanism to clean up damage, to recycle things, right? So we actually have these until, of course, there's a point of no return at the micro level, and of course, eventually at the macro level. We call that death, right? But ultimately, there's a point of no return in some of these systems where the damage starts to overtake it, and then therefore we do have a hardware problem. But fundamentally, it's a software problem. We're losing communication, we're losing intelligence at the cellular level, right? Intracellularly, at the organ level, at the system level, right? These are software problems. We're losing the ability for these systems to really communicate and do what they know how to do.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. We call these the body's own ability to heal. Yeah. And traditionally that might have been called the placebo effect or whatever. No, it's the body's self-healing mechanisms. And if we get ourselves out of the way, the body is its own best healer. And a classic example of that is detoxification. So people will see perhaps an alternative therapist and they'll say, oh, we've got to use these binders and detoxification, all this. That's all great and it can help the body. But ultimately, the body can detoxify itself much better than any external device, as long as it's put in what we call the optimal healing state. So what we've discovered, and for our research, is these are the primary mechanisms that put the body in an optimal healing state to be able to heal itself. And it can be applied to a whole range of different conditions.
That's what I love. And so getting back to the core of what's going on, right? So it's not, you don't treat a disease, you get down to the core of what's going on, and you're addressing things at that level. So maybe you can give me a sense, because I've gone through your program, not bit by bit, but I've looked through it. I've experimented with it, explored it. I've got a couple of clients that are using your program. So maybe you can just give me a sense for what your Gupta program sort of entails. What are these sort of therapies? What are the tools? You mentioned meditation is one, but what are some of the practical aspects of that program so people can get a sense for what's really going on?
Sure. Well, I was actually treating people at my clinic in London in Harley Street, and I could see like 10, 15 patients a week, right? And I thought, I want to bring this to the world, to as many people as possible, right? And therefore we decided to make this an online course. And essentially there are 3 R's of the Gupta program. So the first R, and the most important and unique R, is retraining the brain. And we describe these 3 R's as a dove learning to fly. So if a dove's going to fly, it's going to need 3 things. It needs 2 wings. So that's retraining the brain, relaxing the nervous system. They work together. And the third R is what we call re-engaging with joy. Yeah. Re-engaging with joy, finding that purpose, that direction that we're heading in. And these 3 components really make up our health. And so the first R, the first wing, is retraining the brain. That involves this unique set of 7-step processes where we teach a patient to recognize on the periphery of consciousness those danger signals, where the brain or the body is telling the brain that we are in mortal danger or physical danger. And it's warning you of that to try and get you to change your behavior or do something different, but we don't even recognize it. So recognizing those warning signals and retraining the warning signals to tell our deeper intelligence that we aren't in danger, that actually we are safe, and how we do that process. And repetition is so important. So This is very different to CBT. So imagine the first day of learning to drive a car.
And CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, just to clarify.
Yeah, just to let everyone, yeah. So cognitive behavioral therapy, or the more kind of psychological techniques, would be imagining you're learning to drive a car. Your first day of the driving lesson, you think, right, if I shift my negative thinking and I think really positively, I'll be able to learn to drive this car. No, you need to retrain your brain, create new neural pathways repeatedly, again and again, by turning the steel rail, turning the gear stick. In America, you don't have the gear stick, but pressing on the gas, the brake, all of those things you coordinate and train your nervous system to do it automatically. And then a year later, you can be eating a sandwich on a phone call and still be able to drive, because your system has learned unconsciously how to master this.
And,
so
and
we
see this in sports too, right? Like, I mean, this is why we practice, right? I was a baseball player for a long time, and it's a very nuanced sort of sport. The baseball swing is very technical. There's a lot of aspects to it, and it takes a while, right? And it's not just this sort of brain to muscle thing that I think, at least for a long time, I thought that that's what I was doing. I was retraining just brain and muscles. But there's a deeper nervous system aspect to where when things happen in real time, thinking with football and basketball, it's like you're making these moves virtually unconsciously, that you get into the zone, into a flow where you're naturally able. And if you watch the skilled players, they do these things not because they practice that single move 1,000 times, but they practice a bunch of other moves that were very similar, and their body is now capable of moving in such a fluid manner that they don't even think about it. It's just naturally happening. It's second nature, right? So it's really interesting that we use this in a variety of piano playing, right? Instruments are fantastic for example of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We are constantly training, like every situation that we're in, we're constantly training our nervous system to become what we call unconsciously competent,
Right.
so that we don't need to use up valuable brain space trying to figure out how to drive a car or play baseball or whatever. The system just does it automatically because we've trained it repeatedly. And so this is why, if you apply this to medical conditions and our internal immune system response, if we can train that to respond at the appropriate level, we could just solve so many different conditions out there. This is the exciting thing of this type of work. So we've got, first was retraining the brain. So there's a 7-step process. There's another process called the accelerator technique, which I think you got a little glimpse of when we were together. And there's some other brain retraining techniques that primarily designed to calm down the nervous system and the immune system. And the second R is relaxing the nervous system. So we know that our brain is more neuroplastic and more malleable and changeable when it's calmer. Yeah. And therefore, that's why meditation, breathing, it brings insights, because we're suddenly not involved in the craziness of our mind, but we take a step back and we become the witness of what is going on in the mind, which then creates important insights. So we find that breathing and meditation.
Real quick, for those who aren't familiar with that sort of terminology and that practice, describe the witness a little bit and what's going on there, sort of experientially, why that's beneficial.
Sure. So imagine that there's a bucket of water, and that bucket of water is swirling around, which represents all the swirling thoughts and emotions in our minds. And we are a little stick in that swirling bucket of water. Now, how are we going to get out of that bucket of water? We're stuck in it, and we're identified with the thoughts and emotions. But it's only ourselves, when we take ourselves out of the bucket, we can then observe the swirling and realize, okay, this is why the swirling's happening. And this is how we can calm that swirling down.
And that you're not the swirling, right? Like you're actually something different than the swirling itself, right?
Absolutely. We identify as something separate. And it was Einstein, paraphrasing Einstein, we can't use the same thinking to solve a problem as what caused the problem. And in the same way, we have to kind of take that step back and witness and observe what is going on in the mind. So meditation and breathing and relaxation techniques enable us to become more neuroplastic, as it were, and there's some studies around that as well. And meditation also is shown to turn off over 30 inflammatory genes across the body. So epigenetically, we start reducing inflammation around the body, and breathing does a similar thing as well. And we also treat it holistically. So in that relaxing the nervous system, we look at diet and anti-inflammatory diet, right? But we call it the 80% diet, because so many people get stressed with these exclusion diets, which makes the system even worse. So it's about 80% of the time, this is the anti-inflammatory diet. And sure, you can have cheat days and cheat meals, and that's okay. And then sleep, getting your sleep right is so important, because lack of sleep increases inflammation in the body, and we know that. And then we look at exposure to sunlight and daylight and how important those are to synchronize sleep rhythms, pacing yourself. So all of that kind of holistic side to relax the whole nervous system. And finally, the third R is re-engaging with joy and getting purpose back in your life. So that reminds me of the work of Patch Adams, that famous doctor who treated cancer through laughter and got amazing results. And in a similar way, we teach people to say, don't just wait until your condition is gone to feel happy and to enjoy the small moments of life. When you actually reverse the horse and cart and say, let me be happy now before I get well, then you speed yourself along a course. So this is all about finding things that engage your mind. And what we find is when the prefrontal cortex is engaged in something uplifting and positive, actually it reduces some of these danger signals and starts creating a virtuous circle of health. And that supports the retraining as well. So these three components really work together.
It's really interesting, right? Because I think back to your story, right? And you were on this economics path and you had this sort of objective that you were moving toward, and then things kind of fell apart for you. And, you know, whether you recognize it at that time or not, at some point you decided, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to figure this out, right? And that became your mission. You had a purpose to your day-to-day, right? And I think this is what's interesting about purpose. And I love that you bring this in as one of your core 3 pillars, because to me, I couldn't agree more. This is something I didn't realize until later in my sort of journey as a practitioner and in my own life, how important that is. And the thing with purpose is we can get caught up in it a little bit because it's challenging, right? Especially in our Western culture, we like to think of this, you know, Elon Musk style of purpose in life, or this Mother Teresa type of purpose. And it's like, for me, when I think about purpose, it's what am I getting up for each day? If that's what my purpose is what excites me about getting up. And if I don't know what that is yet, that's okay. But that's what I want to look for, right? It's not this big grandiose thing of being a billionaire or running this major company or feeding 100,000 people, you know, necessarily. It can be those things, but it's the thing that gets me excited and gets me out of bed every single day, right? And once you find that, that's a different story, right? And so again, it can be a temporary sort of life purpose, right? Like you had, where it's like, I'm going to figure this thing out. I don't care what else, I'm going to figure this thing out, right? And your mind, your whole energy is now focused on something that life can offer, right? And what you can offer back to life. So it's a beautiful aspect, and I think it's so. One of my favorite quotes is, you know, it's not I'll be happy when I'm healthy. It's I'll be healthy when I'm happy.
Yes.
Right? And so it's really interesting. The happiness is really the driver of health versus compared to the other way around. And so flipping that on its head, and even that may be tricky at first, right? Because that's a reprogramming of sorts, right? Like we actually might have to rewire that a little bit from our conditioned mind that's used to thinking about bad things and looking for bad things and being afraid of all the things, and flipping that around and go, no, I can actually practice gratitude. I can actually practice being happy, which is a different concept than I think I was certainly raised to believe, and even now it's not my habit. Let's just say.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the day-to-day, colloquially, how we live is, look, I just need to get this done. I've got to get that done. Then I can relax. Then I can be happy. You know, this idea that there is a pathway to happiness rather than happiness is the path, right? There is a pathway to peace rather than saying peace is the path. And I define or an aspect of living your life purpose is the joy is not in the outcome, but in the process. So you enjoy the act of being here on this interview and learning this, and rather than saying, right, we've got to get, 10,000 people watching this. It's about the joy of the doing rather than the outcome. And that is such an important part of purpose.
Yeah, and that can be challenging when you're caught in the middle of a health crisis, if you have a chronic condition that you're dealing with. So I want to honor that as well, that some of this stuff isn't easy per se. And I think the reason it's not easy is because we're breaking that conditioning. That's the hard part. It's breaking that conditioning, right? It fundamentally itself is not hard to be happy. It's not hard to do these things. It's just the conditioning, it's the rewiring, it's the changing. And again, that's where I think your program becomes so beneficial, is because it actually says, okay, hey, look, here is your conditioning. Here's your mental conditioning. Here's your behavioral conditioning. Here's your neurological conditioning. And we can rewire all of these, and here's how we do that, right? And so again, it's taking this theory and really making it practical. And ultimately, I think this is really what I want to convey through this interview is this is how many of us can get better. This is how we can pull ourselves out of these health conditions, is by retraining these things. So like anything else, if I pick up a saxophone right now, I've never played, chances are I'm probably going to be pretty bad. I'm not going to know what does what, how to do it. And so I got to practice, right? And so in so many ways, this is no different. It's just a matter of starting at square one and going through the steps, right? And all the while remembering that I can actually control my state. Maybe not 100% yet, but there's something that I do have some say in this, right? Like I can show up. And so playing that part and remembering and going through these programs, and look, from my experience, this is an iterative process. The process of growth, the process of awakening, the process of enlightenment, if you will, the process of becoming an adult. And I don't mean just an older child, I mean an actual adult. This is an iterative process. In other words, we go forwards and then we go backwards and then we go sideways and then we go forwards again, right? Like it's kind of messy. It's not a straight line per se. And yet, if you just keep showing up and keep applying yourself, what I've noticed is that you just keep moving forward. And before you know it, you look back and you go, wow, I really made it far. How did I get here? This is amazing.
Yeah. No, beautifully said. Beautifully said. And I just to reinforce that, something I really help people also understand is when these changes, these challenges come in life, when we shift our perspective to see the silver lining behind it, that's a very important part of healing. So something we talk about is we are treating these conditions at all 4 levels. So we treat at the physical level because we're talking about diet and activity. We're treating at the emotional level because we help people understand their emotional reactions to their environment and their condition. We're treating at the mental level by retraining these patterns, but also at the spiritual level. And what we mean by that is we take the analogy of the caterpillar turning into a butterfly. That a caterpillar has one level of existence and one level of habits in terms of how it exists. It then goes into a cocoon. And many of our conditions and illnesses, especially chronic illnesses, feel like a cocoon, right? They can feel very isolating. They can feel very painful. And it's very painful for that caterpillar to suddenly sprout wings out the back. But it has to go through that metamorphosis to then emerge as that butterfly and live a different type of life with different type of wings and different type of experiences, but living its potential. It's fuller potential than when it first started. But it took the cocoon to make that happen. And sometimes in our lives, these illnesses, and nobody wishes an illness on anybody, but sometimes they come along because they allow space and time for us to reevaluate our lives. They've got a hidden deeper message or a protective message underlying them. And certainly with a lot of these illnesses that we treat, when people go at that deeper level, they start saying, now I see the connection, all the dots linked together. The way I was living life was unsustainable. It wasn't authentic. I was pushing my body too hard. And so therefore, I'm constantly saying, I'm tired. This is too much. I'm overwhelmed, to the point at which the body literally took it literally and said, right, I'm too tired. I'm too overwhelmed to deal with life. And so when we recognize and when we teach people to go into these deep meditative states and connect with the kind of deeper intelligence of their system, and they come up with amazing, profound answers as to why this condition has come. And when they recognize that, suddenly their health jumps up another level just through that awareness of the deeper spiritual reasons behind the condition. And I think that's so powerful for people to recognize.
Yeah, so your team has done a bunch of research on your program around its effectiveness, right? So tell me about those.
Yeah, for us, the scientific approach and really having the research evidence behind this is so important. So we published a clinical audit which found that with ME and chronic fatigue syndrome patients, 2/3 of patients reached 80 to 100% recovery within 1 year, and 92% of patients made some type of improvement, which was, a great result. And we're very excited that just recently we published a randomized control trial, in fact, the first randomized control trial on this type of neuroplasticity program. And it was with patients with fibromyalgia. And it found that after just 8 weeks intervention, in the control group, there was no impact on fibromyalgia. But in the active Gupta program group, there was close to a 40% reduction in fibromyalgia scores, a halving of pain, a doubling of functional capacity, just in 8 weeks. And that was published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. So that's propelling us now further for further studies in long COVID and similar conditions.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's funny because some of this research needs to be done at the beginning, even though the sort of mainstream medicine doesn't really believe that this can be a therapy for what they view as sort of physical ailments, right? Chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. primarily a physical ailment as seen by most medical professionals. And so once this sort of research gets out there and there's something to it, it really does start to, it's like throwing chum in the water. The sharks start to come. Now you get other researchers kind of looking at things. And so I find that it's really interesting with research like this. It can be slow going at the beginning to really take hold. And then all of a sudden people really start glomming on and say, okay, there's something here. Let's do some research around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give a bit of background to this, the reason that this is so new and different is because if we look at mainstream medicine, it's always been about measurement, what can be measured or observed. And the brain was always the black box, right? So until we could slice open the top of the brain and look at micro neurons and go, right, that neuron's doing that and that, which is, we don't have the technology for that. It's been the black box. And yet, when we understand it from that kind of subjective consciousness experience, we can begin to shift that brain neurology and start creating health. So it's really because it's always been a black box.
I love that. And even take it one step further, the heart we know is kind of the second brain, maybe even the first, right? There's so many neurons. And so with your program, you're not just doing mental exercises, you're going into the deep spiritual stuff, you're getting into purpose. So, you're really affecting so much of the nervous system beyond just the brain too. So this is why, again, I think you're right. It's going to be perhaps impossible. I don't use that word too often, but I think it's going to be very difficult to figure out how do we measure this type of reaction going on at the body level, because there's so much happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to sort of reiterate too that your program is not just a meditation program, right? So the meditation plays a critical and important role, no question. And you're retraining the system to get calm, to be able to even get into that meditative state in a deeper way, to be able to have those messages come through, right? There's a certain amount of sort of relaxing of the system to even have that happen. So I know that there's a lot of practical aspects to what you're doing. So I just want to highlight that as well. And I love your analogy, right? I mean, it's kind of a classic one, but it fits so well here, right? I mean, again, the caterpillar, it's like the caterpillar saying, I want to fly, I want to fly, I want to fly, right? Like they're just so set on flying, and then they're sort of stuffed in a cocoon, like, so to speak, and they're like, oh, this isn't fun. This is not what I want, right? And this is what happens to us humans. We lack the foresight. We don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what the conditions are really facilitating for us later on. And even in that cocoon, we got to sit there and be patient, right? And we just got to sit it out. We got to wait. And it's all the while, it's not what we ultimately want, at least we think, right? And it's exactly the thing that we need to get us there. And then even then, when it's time to sort of get going as a butterfly, we got to we have to push against that cocoon. Like, we have to gain the strength, right? Just like a chick coming out of the egg. Like, we have to have the strength. If you were to unwrap that cocoon for the butterfly without it making any effort, it's not going to be able to fly. It doesn't have the strength, right? Exactly. So we need that same thing.
Yeah, and we use that analogy in terms of exactly what you described. The process of getting better from this condition is the strengthening of the wings.
Totally.
Because you're learning to calm the nervous system down. You're learning to get back into day-to-day activities and keep your nervous system calm. You're learning how to not allow your unconscious brain to get back in those old patterns of protection, or overprotection. So the process of getting well is also a second level of retraining to rehabilitate you back into life. And something we use there is called parts work, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's derived from internal family systems, but the parts work and inner child work is so powerful at helping people recognize some of the deeper patterns that actually may have contributed to the overwhelm at the beginning of the condition, or the overstress at the beginning of the condition. And when they learn that and they really talk to those inner parts and those sub-personalities, they then are able to emerge in the world as a stronger butterfly and are able to live life at a higher level, for sure.
Yeah, I love that. Parts work has been a fantastic element to the work that I do and my own understanding of myself, right? And these are just aspects, fragmented aspects of our sort of ego selves, our protective aspects of ourselves, really brilliances, actually, that we create, brilliant patterns that we create to survive. And yet they don't, they're not the most efficient and effective way to get through life until we integrate them, right? And bring them back into wholeness. And so I love that you bring that in. It's a critical aspect to, I think, understanding ourselves and working through our own psychology. Ashok, this is fantastic. Tell people where they can find more of your work, and particularly where they can find your Gupta program.
Yes. So what we'd love people to do is to just take our kind of 28-day free trial. There's no credit card involved. They can go to guptaprogram.com. So that's Gupta program.com, and there you can watch lots of free videos. You can kind of get a sense of what the program looks like and see if it's right for you. And we go through a very detailed explanation of what causes the condition and different conditions as well. So we go through all of them and people can relate to what they're experiencing. And yeah, that's where they can find out more information. We'd love for people to try this.
Well, and I know you've got a slightly different thing that you've been working on too, but it's along the same lines. I think it's definitely worth mentioning. It's an app called iRise, right? And so I know you're in the heart of development. It's I think maybe in beta or it's out just now. So maybe just tell people a little bit about that, because I think it's a really cool thing that people can add into their wellness regime.
Sure. So we've just launched a new tech startup. So yeah, we're in testing phase at the moment. So it's called iRise, and it is available in App Store and Play Store at the moment, even in its beta version, and people are downloading it right now. And essentially, we're just designing this as your one-stop shop for mental and emotional well-being. So whatever mental and emotional challenge you're facing in life, whatever life challenge, the app recognizes that, asks you how you're feeling, and then creates customized courses, classes, quick exercises that you need in that moment. So it's like the friend in your pocket. Whatever I'm going through, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm having a panic attack, or I've just had an argument with somebody. What do I do? Right, straight in the app, I've had an argument. Right, here's an exercise that's going to help you calm down. And perhaps you need to go on a course on communication or a course on anger management. Whatever you need, it's all there in one place. So we're really excited by that.
Yeah, it's like a little guru in your pocket. That's brilliant.
Yeah, maybe we should patent that, little guru in your pocket.
Yeah, it's awesome. That's fantastic, because that's the thing. Like when we get in these states, we don't necessarily know exactly what to do, right? Like what actions do I take? How do I calm myself? What's the best thing? And so if you can cater meditations and breath works and courses and understandings to be able to do that, it's amazing. It's an amazing tool. So
definitely. And it's about approaching it holistically. So right now, at the moment, there's lots of apps out there that if you have whatever challenge you have, they become a one-trick pony. So whatever challenge you have, do this meditation. Whatever challenge you have, go and do a physical exercise class. But we want to integrate all of that. So whatever problem you have, sure, meditation is going to help, but actually you need some deeper understanding and knowledge behind that. And maybe you'd like to go to a live event. Maybe you need to communicate with people about it. Maybe you need to do some physical exercise. All of it in one place that can help you with that specific situation.
Beautiful. Yeah. Ashok, well, thanks so much for joining me and explaining this unbelievable program that you have. I'm so glad that you created it, and I know it's helping so many people. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Before we kick off the next interview, please let me know in the comment section below what you think of today's presentations. I'd love to hear what has impacted you most and what some of your biggest takeaways have been. I'll be reading and responding to your comments below, so let's chat. Well, I'm so excited to announce our next guest and to really discuss a topic that has been exploding over the last 15 to 20 years. And that is heart coherence, heart rate variability, and how we can use this understanding and this technology to improve our health on a very practical level. And so with me today, I have Dr. Rollin McCraty. He is the Director of Research of the HeartMath Research Center and the HeartMath Institute. As a psychophysiologist, his research interests include the physiology of emotion, heart-brain communication, and the global interconnectivity between people and the Earth's energetic systems. Findings from his research have been applied to the development of many educational programs and technologies to optimize individual and organizational health, performance, and quality of life. Dr. McCraty has acted as principal investigator in numerous studies examining the effects of emotions on heart-brain interactions and on autonomic, cardiovascular, hormonal, and immune system function, and studies to determine the benefits of self-regulation, focused interventions, and heart rhythm coherence feedback in diverse organizational, educational, and clinical populations. Rollin, thanks for joining me today.
See, I should have sent you a shorter bio.
No, it's beautiful. It encapsulates all the work that you guys do. And I know there's so much there. And so maybe we can focus on just generally speaking what HeartMath does, because I know you have a personal sort of side of things. You have a social and interconnective side that you focus on, as well as sort of a global perspective too. So maybe you can just kind of hit on some of the things that you guys are doing.
Wow. Well, you're right. So it's kind of hard to do it's almost impossible to do an elevator kind of speech as people want you to do. But basically, I think at our real core essence, Jason, that HeartMath is really about a set of really user-friendly tools and techniques that allow us to manage stress and navigate through daily life with more grace and ease. So it's really about how do we self-regulate better. And just a little bit more comment on that is that what a lot of people don't think about or often realize is that most of the stress we experience it's always an emotion. It's how we feel.
Yep.
It's not the thing out there. It's our emotional response to it. And it's our emotions that run the show, physiologically speaking. I mean, that's what really drives the activity in our hormonal system, our immune system, the activity in our brain and nervous system. So that's why we focus so much on really emotional self-regulation.
Well, and I love what you guys are doing because you're bringing a scientific lens and a research perspective that help us understand maybe some of these philosophies and practices and techniques that have been taught for thousands of years, right? I mean, I look into a lot of the Vedic work, a lot of the Eastern tradition, Dzogchen, and there's some amazing stuff that's taught. And even in some of the sort of Buddhist lineages, I remember first recognizing, and it was sort of revolutionary when it was introduced to me, that when we experience something, there's an actual response in the body first, then the reaction. In other words, then we interpret that, and then it expresses, right? And I thought, wow, I almost thought it was different at first. I thought it was the reverse. In other words, we respond and then the physiology changes. But once you understand that the physiology is sort of driving this and the emotion is underpinning that, then it flips everything on its head. Now we can change our approach to making that change.
Well, what you're saying is exactly right. And it's also why I'm going to take it back to emotions, because we have emotional feeling responses that start all those changes I was talking about before the information even gets to the higher brain where we have a conscious perception of it.
Right.
So we tend to think that change our thinking, change our emotions. It's the other way around. A lot of our thoughts, what we would call conscious thoughts, are really sorting out and trying to justify what we already felt unconsciously.
I love that. And again, we're going right into the quote unquote heart of the matter here, which is, and this is what you hear in indigenous cultures too. I work with a lot of like shaman cultures and that indigenous from South America. And it's funny because your work and their philosophies are really intertwined, which is that they're teaching to live from the heart. And when you live from the heart, everything starts to shift and improve. And so talk to me about why living from the heart, from that sort of shamanic wisdom is so intertwined with what you guys are doing.
Okay, that's a big one. Let me start physiologically, and then we'll take it to the higher level of that question and that statement. So the heart and brain are more interconnected through the neural systems, and really the heart communicates with the brain and body in four primary ways, but through the nervous system, we'll just kind of keep it to that for right now. The heart sends far more information through our nervous system to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. Now, a lot of people are like, what? Some new discovery. No, this has been known since the late 1800s. It dates back to the original neural anatomy research and work. So for example, one of the primary nerves that connects the glands and organs in our body and in our chest and thoracic cavity and so on is called the vagus nerves. There's two of them, the biggest nerves. These are the longest nerve in the body. They come down through the front and of the body. And they're huge. They're really big nerves. There's thousands of fibers in each one on each side coming down the brain. Well, 90% of those neural fibers, think of them wires or pathways, are coming from the body to the brain. Only 10% is brain down. And by far the largest source or ratio of those afferent, use a neuroscience term, or ascending neural pathways, are coming from the heart and cardiovascular system. So, and this... let me connect another dot here. There used to we have these paradigms in science if you kind of study the history of it, right? And so it's if we go back to the 1800s, late 1800s, William James, some people might know that name. He's considered the father of psychology. Knew this, and they talked a lot about how the brain's interpreting the signals from the body and has a lot to do with the source of emotions and so on. And then around the late 1920s, early 1930s, the pendulum swung the other way completely. And this is at a time that they were just discovering the first hormone, right?
Oh, wow.
And some kind of, in hindsight, silly experiments that kind of did away with that and said, no, it's all about the brain, right? And theoretically, if you could cut the head off and give it the blood and the oxygen it needs, it'd be just fine.
Right. It's the master computer.
It's all, nobody believes that anymore.
Right.
That's kind of nonsense. But that what started the paradigm shifting back to a more balanced perspective was observations of the heart. So you got the brain telling the heart to speed up. Well, it would slow down. Right. And in fact, the literature, the scientific literature of that time, this is 1970s, late 60s, 70s, they're literally using comments like the heart is acting like it has its own brain, or it has a mind of its own. What they didn't know is it does. We now know through the field of neurocardiology that we now call it the heart brain, quite literally. But in around the 70s, two terms were introduced. This is where it becomes really interesting, to describe the kind of global effects that the activity of the heart was having on brain function and perception. And those terms are called cortical inhibition. In other words, cortex, the part of our brain we get paid to go to work for, is inhibited when the heart's in a certain state, or cortical facilitation. So the heart actually enhances neural function when it's in a certain type of rhythmic state, or neural information is being sent. And even though it was kind of downplayed, even back then, they were seeing that, kind of to tie back to something else you said, Jason, the heart was actually somehow knew what the brain had to do next and was changing its state to facilitate whatever our next actions needed to be in the world for survival and so on.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, again, when we think about living from the heart, I think that's a different perspective than what we're conditioned to in the West, right? And I think part of the reason we probably have thought and even maybe even, I wouldn't say intuitively, but we have been conditioned to think that our brain is so important, our head brain, is that most of us identify up here. Like we walk through the world up here.
Yeah, that is true, but yes and no.
Right.
And by the way, the brain's an important thing. I want one and I want it to work well. So this is not about, it's how do we get rid of the heart and brain working together? So we talk a lot about heart-brain coherence or heart-brain synchronization physiologically, because that's when we perform best and we feel best. It's when we get those two systems synchronized. Now I'm talking literal neuroscience language now. So let me take you in another direction that's relevant to where we're going here. So we've been teaching HeartMath techniques and how do we self-regulate for close to 30 years now. And one of the things we were hearing, and still do, pretty universally from so many people was, God, when I practice these techniques and get my heart into what we now call a coherent rhythm or coherent state, that's what leads to cortical facilitation and all these neat benefits. A wide range, 400 plus studies now, wide range of benefits when we can get our physiology in sync. But they were saying, yeah, my intuition is on steroids. It's like, this is different. And then the second thing is, and synchronicities are like, they're way different than they used to be. It's like a way of life now, right? Which we kind of already knew that
there's something there. Yeah.
So but anyway, that we've sorted out a protocol to actually study intuition in a laboratory setting.
I love that.
And there's basically, I won't go into this now because it'd take probably too much time, but there's basically 3 types of intuition. But the most interesting is we call non-local. I mean, the other type is implicit learning. That's well studied and understood. It's all about the brain. Energetic sensitivity, which is our brain and nervous system's capacity to detect very real signals from the environment and pattern match, detect them, and have a conscious intuition.
That would be like our sixth sense, so to speak.
It could be.
Perceiving other things that are so subtle.
Well, we could call all 3 types in a way sixth sense, and people tend to. Anyway, energetic sensitivity. So you feel like somebody's staring at you, and you turn around, and sure enough, they are, and you can sort of feel other people's feelings. That's we radiate magnetic fields, which you can measure. So we're detecting those. So empathy, these types of things. But non-local is the most interesting and most relevant to your original question around why live from the heart. And by the way, just a little short sidetrack here. We do tend to live from the head in the Western world, but I doubt if very, very few, if any, of our listeners out there, when they fell in love, told their loved one, "I love you with all my brain." Right. I mean, probably wouldn't go over well.
Well, and that's just it. I think it's the perception that we're up here, right? But it's almost like the perception is disconnected from here because we're always here, right? This is the interesting thing, is that we're always living from our entire body, and yet the perception is not quite recognized.
Yeah, and if you ask kids, where are you? Where are you?
Right.
Who are you? They always point to the heart. It's interesting. Always. I've never seen it any other way. But anyway, back to my intuition research, because it's really, I think, answers a lot of the bigger question you started this conversation with, Jason. So anyway, we measuring brain waves and electrocardiograms and skin conductance and a bunch of other stuff to really kind of see if we could study the flow and sequence of intuitive type signals. And I won't get into all the gory details. These are very well thought out, rigorously done. This is all published for people who don't want the gory details, and go to the HeartMath Institute or heartmath.org website and get all the free papers and things. There's many of them there. But basically what we found is I should give a little more context here. These are subjects or participants set in a computer, and then an image shows up on the screen that is randomly selected. And it's either going to be a really yucky picture, bad guys with knives at women's throats and snakes striking at the screen and, stuff like that. Or it's going to be nature scenes and flower pots and bunny rabbits and things like that. But so the data is being recorded, and the computer doesn't even randomly, through a very rigorous random process, selects the picture after we've recorded the data already. So it's impossible to know what this future image is going to be for anybody. Even the computer doesn't know. But what we found was that the heart responds prior to seeing whatever that future image is first, then sends a measurably different neural signal to the brain, and you have a brain response, then a body response, all before you see the future image. But the real flow is heart, brain, body, and the body is where you come conscious of the feeling, the gut gets the credit. Mm-hmm. Right? Or the hair on the back of the neck, but it's really heart, brain, body, and if you're paying attention, a conscious feeling of dread, or it could be, a really positive feeling that I should, engage with this person or make this business decision, and so on. So the way I got that published, this is back in the 90s, late 90s, in that era, was to talk about the heart having access to a field of information outside the boundaries of time and space. Perfectly acceptable language at that time, right? Entanglement and non-locality had all been, except it was only supposed to happen, in very cold or subatomic type things. And here we're showing the same thing in, big organs like brains and hearts, especially hearts. And anyway, that's all been blown past all that ideas now in quantum, even in the quantum physics world. Macroscopic objects are entangled and these types of things. But so what is a field of information outside the boundaries of time and space?
Right. This is okay. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. I
mean,
mean,
come on. Go. You're leaving me hanging here. There's something here that's useful.
Well, yeah. So what? I'm way out of the closet now. Through my own experience and many others, it's what you can call your larger self. Mm-hmm. Your higher capacities, your soul, your spirit, higher self. Most cultures, almost all cultures, have a word for it. So this was a very rigorous laboratory study that suggests, hey, the great religion philosophers have been right all along, right? Because it's even in our language.
Yeah.
If you want to know the answer, go to your heart, right? Or put your heart into it, or so many of these type statements that we intuitively know that there's something more about the heart than just being a blood pump, right?
Right. And this is what's interesting, right? Is that you're getting to the practical nature of living from the heart, right? And so your research, I think, it helps solidify this for us and ground this for us, these philosophies into a scientific reality. And that's only half the work, in my opinion. In other words, okay, great, you proved that. Now, how do I facilitate that?
Yeah, well, right, you got to do it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so this is what part of your guys' work has been in your research.
It's what our focus is on, is really developing. And a key here is getting the heart into what we call a coherent rhythm or a coherent state. And
before you get into that, maybe you can help me define coherence for me, because there's some real profound, we talk about coherent light in the form of lasers, we can cut through metal, right? Whereas my flashlight can't do anything like that. So there's something about coherence that is really, really important.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start with what coherence means. Yeah. If you look it up in the dictionary, first definition, most public type of perceptions and uses of the term has to do with how well I'm able to put my words together into a coherent sentence structure? Does it convey meaning? Right? And if I'd had a bit too much to drink last night and I'm uttering nonsense, you'd be saying, God, he's incoherent, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's similar in physics, but coherence is used in all branches of science and physics. You can't think of one where the coherence isn't central in a way. And it usually has to do with how we describe the behavior of the parts of a larger complex system. Like us, we're extremely complex systems that, all the cross time and scales that we have to coordinate things. So coherence is a simple way to think of it, how harmoniously aligned and are the parts of the system working together. Mm-hmm. So that it implies there has to be connection across all the different levels of scale, cells to organs and organs to working together to right into social contexts, and then even with the earth fields and so on, all have to be coherently, harmoniously aligned. So we can measure how coherent a system is. And another key aspect of coherence when we're talking about a coherent system is that the output or the function is greater than the sum of the parts.
Okay, hold on. Let me pause you there, right? Because that's a really, really critical aspect, and it points to the laser sort of example I gave, which is that something new emerges. It's like a different property is then burst through this idea of coherence.
Yeah, and energy efficiency is another key concept. When in a coherent system, we're utilizing energy very efficiently, which nature does.
Right.
It's very smart about how. So we used that term when we were studying physiology and emotions. Now, one more piece we probably need to talk about, Jason, is heart rhythms.
Right. Yes. Because
that's how we measure coherence.
And maybe as part of that, maybe I'd love for you to discuss this idea of, I think there's this prevailing thought that only good things happen when we're in this slow heart rate, Zen, chilled out type of thing. But I know that's not true because there's times in sports when I'm really focused, where I really need my heart rate up. I need things to be switched on. I'm running from a bear. There's a different element here on the high side as well as the low side. So maybe you can
absolutely.
that.
Yeah. The idea that we have to relax and chill out, that actually decreases performance.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how many coaches, football or any kind of team sports, does the coach get them, okay, guys, let's chill out and right? No. But anyway, so most people know what heart rate is, right? How many times does the heart beat in a minute, right? But in reality, our heart rate is changing with each and every heartbeat. The time between each pair of heartbeats is always different. That's what's called heart rate variability. Now, this is what gives rise to the heart rhythm. Most people have heard that we have a heart rhythm, which you can plot out. If you measure this beat-to-beat change, you can see that the rhythm is always changing. The heart's going up and down all the time. Now, when people are feeling things like frustration, right, these stressful emotions that I was kind of talking about, which utilize energy, impatience, anxiety, feelings of overwhelm. Stress is always a feeling, right?
Yep.
That, what you see in the heart rhythm is that it becomes very chaotic looking, right? So you've got one pair of heartbeats speeding up and next slowing down, but in a very chaotic way. And that is literally reflecting that the activity in our higher brain systems and in our autonomic nervous system is desynchronized. We are out of sync.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like driving your car with one foot on the accelerator and the other, riding the brake with the other foot. Mm-hmm. It's a jerky ride. You're using a lot more gas, right? And putting a lot more strain, wear and tear on brakes, drivetrain, all those parts. It's very similar to what's going on in us. Whereas when we're feeling good, right? You walk out the door in the morning. It's one of those days, blue skies and the perfect temperature, and you just kind of, oh God, what a beautiful day. Well, you may not think it or say it to yourself, but you're feeling appreciation. Right? That takes our rhythm into what we call a coherent rhythm. It's kind of like a rolling hills rhythm over time. And that's and lots going on in our body when you see that rhythm. In terms of inner synchronization, hormonal balance, the list goes on. It's an optimal state that we naturally go into when we're being kind, when we feel compassion, we feel appreciation, forgiveness, right? I said, right? You can't think yourself into coherence.
Right.
And then you're sending a very different signal to the brain when you're in that coherent state. that takes us into that cortical facilitation. So we're now able to clear brain fog, focus, make better decisions, right? But to kind of go back to where we started this, what we showed in a bunch of series of experiments, when we're in that coherent rhythm, it really opens that intuition channel to our larger self, who we really are. So now we're able to kind of access that non-local intuitive information right in the moment. So it becomes a way of life. It's our inner GPS is a way of thinking about it.
When you said something really important there, in the moment, right? And this is what I hear again from these wisdom traditions, from these indigenous cultures, is that the heart is sort of the place, if you want to define it as a place, but it's the source of the now, of the moment itself, right? And whereas the brain, and this is what they teach in a lot of these cultures, is the brain is really there to access the past or worry about the future. Right. And so this is the absence of being in the moment. And again, sort of some of those wisdoms will teach that if you are 100% truly in the moment, it is impossible to be sick. It is impossible to be sad. In other words, in the moment, everything is fine. Now that becomes the challenge, or the objective, or the North Star, is to bring our whole selves into the moment, which again points us back to the heart.
Right. Well, it's in the heart that's really elevating consciousness to a higher vibration. And so from that perspective, that more objective, higher vibrational perspective, if I can use that language here, I think people are starting to understand that there is different levels of consciousness, that we can really be at peace.
Yes.
With whatever the situation is.
Right. Total acceptance. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you just, kind of give up on whatever's happening. No, but it's also where we bring in more of our own innate intelligence on how to solve or deal with whatever the external situations are, whether they're chaos or not.
Well, it gets into some of this Buddhist philosophy, right, of compassion, right, which really is a heart-based emotion. I guess most of it is, but it's having compassion for all that exists, right? So it's not,
and including yourself.
Right, exactly. Perhaps most importantly, right? And so there's something you mentioned at the beginning that I think is really important too, that I'd love for you to elaborate on, which is self-regulation. So from a sort of physiological perspective, what does that look like? What is self-regulation, and how, I guess, why is that an important thing to focus on?
Well, okay, so we kind of already covered how important emotions are. They run the show, and it's things like anxiety and impatience and frustration and, or some people flat out anger that really throw our system into a chaos, out of coherence internally. So being able to become aware of and self-regulate our emotional diet is absolutely the key to making better choices, but aging. I mean, stress is on all the energy systems it's throwing into motion in this chaotic way is rapid aging.
Right.
So self-regulation we can take that from so many levels. I mean, if you look in society, it's the failure of self-regulation that underlies almost all of the key problems we face in society, all the polarizations and separations we have. 90% of healthcare visits to a primary physician are stress-related. That traces right back again to a lack of self-regulation. Or we can talk about it's as simple as not charging new things on your credit card if you're on a budget, or eating, that second piece of cake, right, if you're on a diet, and so on.
Right. So it's happening on the autonomic level, right? And also on the behavioral and emotional level. That's where they sort of get expressed. And there's so much happening. I think this is where, when we talk about all the sort of diseases of aging or the chronic issues that we see today, have this root in this self-regulation, right? I mean, I sometimes
failure of self-regulation, right?
And this happens, I think, to all of us, right? Yeah. We get out of. I recognize that I'm in a state that, oh wow, I've actually lost regulation. I'm dysregulated. So, what is it that I can do to sort of bring myself back into regulation? And maybe you can touch on how your guys' work and technology. And you have technology, and you have sort of courses. How does it provide a sustainable sort of model? Because it's not like I want to take an allopathic approach and just use this technique to get me out of this messed up state, and then I got to keep doing this. Can I sustain this? Can I bring more stability to this sort of emotional processes?
Yeah, those are good terms you're using, Jason. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, let me see if I can say this simple. We could do a whole show on this topic, but it has to do with what we call baselines. So one of my scientific mentors was a guy named Carl Pribram. Late Carl Pribram. He passed away probably about 5 years ago now. And a very famous guy. He's considered the father of modern cognitive neuroscience, and was head of brain research at Stanford and then went on and opened other labs after he retired from there. And some people might have heard of the holographic perception theory. That was Dr. Pribram. He's the guy who coined the term executive functions for the frontal part of the brain and so on.
Yeah, he made an impact on
He was a huge impact.
Yeah,
He's one of the first neurosurgeons in the world, actually.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's fascinating he was a very close friend of mine, actually. But the point I want to make here is one of his passions was trying to understand emotion, how we experience and what emotions are. And what he basically proved, and this is so important, what I'm about to say, is that the way emotional experience works is we form what we called reference patterns or baselines in the brain that are based on repetition. Things we do a lot form stable baselines. And once we form many baselines as we have new experiences and new emotional experiences, that once a baseline is formed, the brain is unconsciously always comparing the current input to the reference, to the or to the baseline, and looking for a pattern match. Mm-hmm. Match or not match. And this is one of the core functions of the amygdala. A lot of people have heard about the amygdala these days. Used to really piss them off when people would say, oh, the fear center and all that. It's just not. Right. The amygdala's role is to determine what is familiar and not familiar. It's what it does.
And this is the conditioning sort of aspect of.
Yeah, it's familiar, not familiar. And the different parts of the amygdala are doing that from the external sensory system, what we see, hear, smell, But another chunk of the amygdala or section is doing that from the body's internal systems, primarily the rhythms of the heart. And this is why emotions are reflected in the rhythms of the heart. They go directly, the heart rhythms come up, the neural activity I was talking about earlier goes through one of those pathways is directly to the amygdala. In fact, the core nucleus of the amygdala is literally synchronized to the heart. Huh. So whatever the heart rhythms are, the core nucleus of the center of the amygdala is seeing, and it's monitoring that. And through this mismatch process, familiar or not familiar, right? It's saying, okay, this is a mismatch. That's going to make me pay attention, or it could lead to a fear response, right?
So, okay, I don't. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, but here's the key. Let me use an example from one of my own life when I was a young kid. One of my grandmothers worried about us constantly. If she wasn't worried, in her world, she wasn't caring. Mm-hmm. So now in today's language, we would call that a maladapted baseline. She had worried so much that became her familiar reference. The brain wants a match. That's when it feels comfortable. So that spins us up into constant anxiety. To have a match, as crazy as this sounds, to feel comfortable because it's familiar.
Right? This is great because I work with this stuff all the time with my clients and of course with myself too. But I love that that you just connected a new dot for me of why that's happening. And the other component to this is this idea of, let's say, positive change can be challenging. In other words, people can sit in meditation and struggle to maintain it.
Let's take this one step farther, because this is where I'm really rounding this off. This is a very elegant model, but it goes way deeper than what we can get into now. But what Pribram also proved was that the only way you can establish or change a baseline is to change the input from the heart to the amygdala. You cannot think yourself into a new baseline. Right. So it's why we repeat the same patterns over and over in life. Right, and it's why change is, you can't think yourself into sustained change.
Right. Will is not going to work.
Exactly. So when you get into a coherent heart rhythm, that is the signal and the pattern going directly to the amygdala. So we practice this regularly enough, and it doesn't take that. This is the good news. It doesn't take that long if we're sincere about it. All right, we keep getting coherent, and then in our techniques, we activate it or a regenerative feeling like appreciation or compassion along with that. That's our natural conditioned response that we're born with, in a healthy environment. You're reprogramming the baseline very quickly. This can be done in a matter of weeks. And that's when this becomes transformational and sustained. It becomes the new automatic. We don't have to work so hard. Right? You follow what I'm saying? But
100%.
Here's the key: you can't think yourself in, not directly to a new baseline.
No question.
Got to change the activity of the heart.
And this is what gets interesting when I think about some of the work that I've done, and I've seen numerous other people get amazing results from some of these new psychedelic therapies, some of the ayahuascas with indigenous shamans. And not to say that is the only way to go, but what's interesting about some of those works is that behavioral change happens instantaneous for some people that have been trying for decades. And so there's always this thought of like, how does that work physiologically, biologically speaking? And I think this perhaps one of those reasons. Same thing with breath work and some of these meditative techniques. And of course, what you guys are doing, forming a really scientific way to go about this, measuring the results so that we know exactly how to repeat this stuff for each person.
Yeah, let's take breath work, because you mentioned that. And in the first step of most of the heart math techniques, self-regulation techniques, we call it heart-focused breathing, right? So breathing is something we have, and this is nothing new to you, Jason, but we have conscious control over. I can choose to breathe deeper and slower and at a rhythm. And if we breathe at a 10-second rhythm, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, that happens to be the rhythm of our natural resonant frequency between the heart, brain, lungs, and system. So breathing at that rhythm, which happens to be a rhythm that a lot of ancient people got onto without understanding the physiology and science of it, and putting focus on the area of the heart, we know we can help shift that rhythm into the coherent state. So breathing modulates the heart rhythm. Right? There's a lot of mystery. Well, let's take the mystery out of breathing. Why does it work? I call it grandma's wisdom. Right, breathe, honey. When you're emotionally upset, because I won't go into the mechanisms, but there's neural pathways between the lungs and the vagus nerves that come down to the heart. So whatever our breathing pattern and rhythm is, how deep we're breathing, and the frequency of the rhythm is modulating the heart rhythm. We can look just at the heart and know exactly what somebody's breathing rhythm is. So when we choose to breathe a little slower and deeper, like I'm starting to feel stressed in a traffic jam or whatever, starting to feel that emotional reaction, we can turn that around. The first step is breathing, because that takes the amplitude out of the emotional response. But the way it works is the breathing rhythm modulates the heart rhythm, which then changes the input going up to the brain and to the amygdala and many other brain areas as well. So
so what is it about heart-focused breathing? Like, I wouldn't say that you developed, but that you identified. Maybe you did develop, but what's going on there? How did you identify something that and measure that, so to speak? Because look, it's probably appropriate time to measure to mention some of your technologies that you guys have, because you have the Inner Balance, which is a really cool device, and the EM Wave. And so how are you using some of those technologies? And by the way, what's cool about these, and this isn't a pitch for your guys' stuff, but it's really accessible for people. That's what I love about your technology. It's not $4,000 machine that people have to buy. Yeah. It's less than a couple $100, which is unbelievably accessible, particularly with respect to how much benefit you can gain.
Yeah, and it's very mobile.
Yeah.
Right. So let me answer your first question. So there's a whole industry based on the fact that where we focus attention, if we practice, we can change specific physiological changes.
Right.
Like you can put temperature sensors on your arm, and with training, change the temperature just to that area. The whole biofeedback industry is based on this fact. Right. In fact, biofeedback was invented by the founders of it, which was also on my advisory board, Joe Kamaya, the first to ever do biofeedback, to help people learn that they could self-regulate, right? That we can learn to self-regulate different body functions. Now, when we want to get into a coherent state, we're wanting to shift the rhythm of the heart. So that's why the focus of attention in the center of the chest is important. And then you're breathing a little bit deeper and slower than you normally would. And that helps move us into the natural resonant frequency of the autonomic system, the heart-brain loops and communication systems. So then so that's why heart-focused breathing is step one. But then in most of our techniques, there are different ones for different reasons. Then you try and consciously activate a regenerative emotion, such as appreciation. Now we start with appreciation because that's for the widest range of people, no matter what culture you're in. That's something we can do. Right, I can appreciate that it's a nice day, or I have a home to go home to, or I'm alive. Right, it doesn't matter, and that's what takes us into that deeper, sustained state of coherence, and really starts opening the heart and that intuitive connection. And once you do that, then the next obvious step I shouldn't say obvious, but we teach in some of our techniques, it's okay. Ask your heart what's a better solution or approach to whatever the problem might be that one is facing.
I love that.
And then shut up and listen for the answer is my rounded off way of saying it. But of course, it's not the real step. But
yeah, no, it's great because this is accessible again to everybody, right? We can all access this.
We all have a heart.
All access this level of mind or this emotion, whether it's gratitude, compassion might be another one, right? That we can tap into, of course. And you can probably measure and play around with these things. Absolutely. I'm sure you have, but you're using the breath to sort of carry that into the body, right? Like that's such an easy way to do this. And I think what's cool too is that, again, what I like about measurements, right? This is sort of the scientific biohacker in me, which is that I can play with these things and perceive changes and play around on a somatic, intuitive level and learn some things. And when I use something like technology to sort of reaffirm and go, oh, that's what I'm feeling. And it's this feedback that I'm getting that can, I think, enhance. In fact, we see this with neurofeedback itself. It's like there's something about this visual component that is conveying inherent information to the very thing that's perceiving the change, and there's a faster result, right? So maybe you can talk about how that works.
Well, yes. So we invented HRV feedback, biofeedback. That first came out of our lab. It's everywhere now. I mean,
and so that's actually looking at the HRV pattern, which to my cognitive mind makes absolutely no sense, but yet something about seeing those rhythms and patterns is informing the heart-brain connection itself.
Let's take it back. If you're going to establish a new inner baseline,
right,
having the feedback to make sure that I've gotten into that coherent state, if we're going to practice that, it just makes common sense to have the feedback to know that this is the state, the optimal state that I'm trying to instate as my new automatic state or reference state in my brain.
Right.
So it gives people a way to practice the techniques. Okay, oh yeah, I'm there. And then they're really neat, the devices like Inner Balance, M-Wave,
totally.
The different global coherence apps.
Maybe you could talk about how they work, because you put one on your ear, right?
In fact, I've got one of our sensors over here. This is a wired, there's a Bluetooth version. They're really simple. You just put a little clip on your earlobe, and then it plugs into your phone, and then it gives you, it's pretty complicated.
It's amazing where we're at. I love technology. It's great.
So it's calculating your heart rhythm, your HRV. And there's a lot of apps out there now that are measuring how much variability you have.
Which is a good thing, right?
Which is fine, but we do something quite different. We're feeding back the pattern of the rhythm, because that's what reflects how in sync the heart and brain are. It has nothing to do with how much variability,
right?
Which varies with age and a lot of things. So this is really a technology that trains you how to shift into an optimal state. And another really important focus we do here at HeartMath is to use these techniques. The techniques are pretty simple by design, deceptively simple sometimes. To use them in the moment, back to that, because it's nothing wrong with meditation. I meditated for years before I got into this, but I could also have a great meditation in the morning. I used to own a big electronics company, and have a great meditation, fly around the universe, and be really pissed off before I even got to work because of the traffic, So then there I was, bathing myself in stress hormones, and then the day just went on from there. So this is really about when you first start feeling those inner triggers, right? Or I'm starting to drift off into, anxiety or whatever. That's right when you use these techniques. So it's in the moment throughout the day, daily life. And then before long, we've trained ourselves into that new baseline that we don't even have to work so hard to think about it.
And this is why it's important, right, in the moment, is because you're actually in this pattern interrupt. In other words, that's the perfect opportunity to not recondition those same responses.
Exactly. In fact, that's the perfect term. You're interrupting the old familiar pattern, right? And turning around those old familiar things. And that takes some energy and some effort in the beginning. Right. But it's surprisingly, for a lot of people, how fast the brain's very adaptive, right? So we can adapt into the new patterns and rhythms. We just have to care enough about ourselves and others to do the work.
And what I've noticed too in my life, as I've done some of this type of work with your guys' technology and some others, is that you start from that baseline, and something happens in your day-to-day, and you might have this big response that's immediate and that it stays on. In other words, you're activated for a long period of time. And then through this work, the amplitude starts to diminish. In other words, you don't get as activated, and then it doesn't stay on as long, and it's easier to shut off. And then over time, that same stimulus doesn't even hardly elicit a response, or in other words, maybe it does, but it remains internal. In other words, I can feel the physiological changes, but there's no expression. I'm better regulated. And then eventually even the physiological changes doesn't start to happen as much, right? So again, this can be something that you see on the news, something that aggravates you on social media, politics, family dynamics, in job, money is a big one, right? Money is a huge energetic stimulus. And so what's cool, again, taking it down to the practical level, is that we can start to walk through our day to day in much greater ease and peace without reactive. And the reason I think the reactive partially is so important gets into some of your other work, which is the interpersonal social dynamics. If we can better regulate that, so we're better regulating ourselves, better regulating the social interactive environments, which again extends to the global. And all of a sudden, this is how we start to evoke change, which again is what they've been teaching for thousands of years in some of these traditions, which is the change starts here, but it doesn't end here though, right? Like that's so important to what you guys are doing too.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of what we're saying and even talking about today is not new.
Right.
But what we have added, I think, and not just heart math, there's many other really neat systems out there, but as we are adding the practical how-to. Totally. How do you actually do it in the moment?
And this is what I think is important is we're studying. It's really important to say, okay, yes, for thousands of years, they've been right. Cool. How do we do this faster, more effective, and more tailored to our environments? Because look, our culture is not we have not set up our culture to sit around and meditate for 10 to 12 hours. Like most householders don't do that. And even in India and some of these other cultures. So how do we tailor this modern world to the correct sort of philosophies that have been established?
Well, and not to pick on meditation. Again, I've meditated for 15 years before I learned some different approaches. That doesn't necessarily help us it does, but it doesn't really solve our in the moment reactions. It's not really shifting the baselines.
Right. Totally. And I think even some of the brilliant meditation teachers I know will gladly admit that there's other work that needs to be done that really has to do with some of the conditionings from our childhood, the interpersonal stuff, and some of these things that need to be reworked, particularly on a somatic level. Now I want to diverge a little bit here because we've been talking about very practical applications for this and how it can impact our day to day. On the health side of the equation, right? And this is where I think a lot of people are wondering too. How can we connect the dots for some of this better self-regulation and the emotional states to the diabetes and the chronic inflammations and all these things that we see, autoimmunity and that kind of thing? Because I know you have research papers on this stuff too, right?
On all of those, yes, and heart failure and arrhythmias and hypertension, and so I'm going to bring it right back to the heart coherence. When we're in a heart coherent state, like there's a lot going on, far more we can get into today about what's going on in our body. Coherence being that energy efficient state. So the activity, heart, brain, lungs, the whole vascular system is now operating in a highly efficient state. So it's the stressful emotions that take us out of that synchronized state. Mm-hmm. So learning and that's what's really driving hormonal imbalances and so on. So as we learn to manage those stressful in the moment emotions, right, we're starting to reduce the burden we're putting on our physiology and the body's natural regenerative processes. Mm-hmm. So that's a
big one. Sorry, I want to really highlight that. It's natural regenerative. In other words, that's our baseline state. The body's trying and wants to regenerate and rebuild and be coherent, right? And it's these things that take us out of that natural state.
Yeah, so we're stopping those. But then being in a coherent state is also the highly regenerative state. So the body can repair itself much faster. In fact, just being we have several papers published on this, if you ever take your blood pressure, and if you can get in coherence for even a minute, just get in a coherence, take your blood pressure again, you'll find that your systolic blood pressure is dropped by, or mean blood pressure as well, by about 10 points. That fast. Wow. And so blood pressure also has baselines and set points. Right. Really, that's how our physiology operates at all levels. So practicing coherence, in fact, there's multiple studies published now that show that just coherence training or regular practice is one of a very effective treatment for essential hypertension. And several studies have actually shown significant healthcare cost reductions in population-wide studies that have brought in coherence training. So that's just an example of one.
Totally. Right? And what, I know you guys, you don't focus on sleep, but I'm curious, have you looked at any research on heart coherence, heart-brain coherence in sort of the sleep functions? And
absolutely.
I'm just thinking of that. This is where most of the healing happens, right? Is when we sleep, and of course, sleep is critical for health.
It's actually the first half of the sleep cycle is where most regenerative processes going during sleep. That's a whole other topic we can open up there. In fact, we do a 24-hour HRV assessment for clinics all around the world, especially functional medicine clinics. And you actually see that in people that are either overtraining in athletics, where we expended more energy than we recover, or we just had a really emotionally stressful day. What you see is in the first half of the sleep cycle at night, we did a lot of 24-hour measures, right? That heart rate stays, it should just drop down like a U and stay down. But then if we've had a stressful day or overtrained, it's the first half of the sleep cycle, heart rate takes hours to get down to its nighttime level. That's one of the strongest indicators.
So it's how fast can you get down there?
Right. It's of these types of things, short-term effects like stress and overtraining. But what disrupts that nighttime sleep is what we do during the day.
Right.
It's the carryover effect of all the, say like me, I will, like a lot of other people, pick on cortisol, because it's kind of a high level in the hierarchy of the energy metabolism. So we're adding, and cortisol is not a bad hormone. We need
but it can
cortisol.
But it can be destructive, especially if it's
if we're pumping
nonstop.
too much of it into the system unnecessarily.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
It's exactly what we're doing when we get mad at the person who didn't act like we want them to in traffic, or in staff meetings and emails and texts, watching the news. We're just pumping, pulsing cortisol, which has a long, the downstream effects of cortisol last many hours. It modulates at the DNA level.
Right.
Very much unlike hormones like adrenaline and so on, which basically burn as energy and they clear very quickly. Cortisol is a different animal in that regard. So if we're doing a lot of this during the day, the carryover into the night cycle is exactly what you see. Right. So most sleep problems really have to do with our lack of stress management during the day, our emotional management.
Well, and this is kind of why I wanted to bring this in, because your technology is really effective in the moment. And sometimes, maybe at the beginning we don't have the wherewithal or the know-how to bring this in. Over time, with your guys' training, it becomes sort of second nature.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the other really important area I think that I can see this being beneficial is both when we wake up and also when we go to sleep. So in other words, before we go to sleep, there's a perfect time to use your guys' technology and your programs to be able to initiate that sort of sleep cycle and the regenerative capacity of sleep in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, get coherent before going to sleep. And
right.
I personally practice when I wake up in the morning and take at least 5 minutes or 10 if I can, and get coherent to prep for the day. So I'm starting the day in that stable state, that more ordered, in sync state. And then of course practicing, stuff happens, life's life, and then practicing the techniques in the moment. And so one of the things we teach in most of our training programs is prep yourself. So many things we go into in life, whether it's a staff meeting or whatever, knowing that there's going to be that person that tends to get us and so on. So prep, get ourselves coherent and stable before we go into those situations. That way we're able to maintain our composure a lot longer or more stable through it, and then reset, and then shift and reset is the other thing. I mean, using one of the techniques to either prep or shift and reset. You actually said as much. We just put language to that.
Right.
Because you can get triggered, even over an email or something, and it's going on. We're rehashing it, and
you loop. You actually loop.
You loop, and it has an energetic effect that can last for hours. But we can start cutting that from hours to minutes.
Yeah.
With some practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I just want to recap here just some of the benefits that we've kind of talked about here today, because as we utilize this technology and these techniques, we can move through our day with more ease and grace. We can show up in the world in a more coherent way, in a way that we really want to. We can have a deeper and more profound impact on the world around us. We can change our health state, right? We can actually improve our health both in the short term and in the long term. We can regenerate in a new way. We can improve our sleep directly, as well as improve the functional aspect of our sleep, our architecture, as well as the regenerative capacity within our sleep itself. So there's so much we can do with this. And there's a couple things here I would love for you to clarify, because you have the EM wave, right? That's one of your pieces of technology, as well as the inner balance. What's the difference between those two for people that are looking to maybe employ some of this stuff?
So M wave is more the professional device that clinics, mental health providers, doctors would use to help train their patients into coherence. And so it's our family schools use it a lot because it's multi-user database, has games, a lot of really cool stuff built into it.
Well, that's cool. I mean, gamifying this stuff is great. I mean, it
came out when we first came out with it in 1999. It had games in it
cool.
Yeah,
I love that.
Then the other app is the Global Coherence app, which is our newest one, and that measures group coherence. So this is perfect if you're working in a leadership team or a sports team, where you really want to get coherence, same concept, coherence at the team level or the group level or family level. So it allows us to measure the coherence of the group.
I love that. I didn't know you guys had that. That's fun. Yeah. I'm gonna look into that for me. That's great.
Right. It is. And then we're also doing work now looking at so there's coherence at the group level, but then there's also synchronization. So heart to heart synchronization is very real. And what we're seeing is that when we help people get in sync with one another now, not only in sync in our own physiology, that underlies pro-social behaviors, collaboration, more solving problems at the team level. So not only does our personal performance increase, we can actually increase team or group performance by learning to get more coherent and then more in sync.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm just thinking about how much this can be applied. I mean, I'm thinking the big corporations and groups, like they have a big incentive to sports teams, right? They have big incentives to cooperate and
sports teams, and the people who have been onto this for a while are some of the more enlightened sports teams, and some of the military units like Navy SEALs have worked with them for many years. They get this stuff, that you need to be in sync personally, but also as a group.
And just to kind of close out here, what I love about this technology too, on both the personal level as well as the group or social level, is that I can see this being used at the beginning as a necessary tool, but then eventually it's almost like you can shed the training wheels, because now
you form those new baselines.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, how to do this without the technology, which isn't to say that you need to get rid of the technology, but I think it's always important to establish.
It's not dependent on the technology.
Exactly. Yeah. You want to empower the people, and that's what I think this can do in a very, very effective way.
And I'm glad you said that, because I'll say it directly. We invented the technology to facilitate people learning the skills.
Beautiful. Yeah. And in that way, it very much is like training wheels. Like, if you think about a kid on a bike, it's really about maintaining balance, and it's very subtle when the balance is off. And at first, you can't really feel when the balance is off, and you can't self-correct, you can't self-regulate, right? And so once you figure that out, then you can feel the subtleties of the dysregulation, and all of a sudden you can balance in a variety of different circumstances: uphills, downhills, side hills, crazy things going on, wind, right? Yeah. So we can weather the storm in so many ways. So Rollin, tell people where they can find more of your work and some of this technology that I mentioned.
Very simple, heartmath.org.
Beautiful.
And, .org, not .com, but there is a .com as well. That's more the commercial side, but on the research and with the nonprofit research arm, and a lot of free resources on our website, and a lot of, if people are into the science, there's a gazillion papers on our
really research
library.
Yeah.
And, also, I would recommend, we just updated one of our books I'm a co-author on, called Heart Intelligence. It's a great way to get started.
That is a great book.
Yeah. The new edition's even updated from, which was just released a few weeks ago.
Awesome. I love that.
And if you're into the science, then another one of my books is Science of the Heart. And it's really written at more of a scientific American level. And I think it's 12 chapters, something like that go into different aspects of the science, like intuition, energetics, which we didn't talk about today.
That's actually my realm. I love energetics. That's kind of that's the fun stuff.
It's the future.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Dr. McCraty, I love the work that you guys are doing. I really appreciate your willingness to get out there and educate on some of this stuff. I think it's really cool to establish a scientific understanding. It's so helpful to really ground some of these things that I think we intuitively feel, or that we've heard from some of these cultures for a long time.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you've been a great host. I really enjoyed our time together.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate it, Rollin. Take care.
My pleasure.
If you're enjoying these presentations so far, please consider grabbing lifetime access to the entire event at the limited time discounted price. Not only are you getting instant on-demand access to 35 expert interviews and over $1,800 in bonuses, your support also allows us to continue to produce these events so that we may get this cutting-edge and potentially life-saving information out to those who desperately need it. We really do appreciate your support. Welcome back to the Ultimate Holistic Health Summit, latest breakthroughs you haven't heard of. With me now, I have the distinct pleasure to chat with Kyle Kusunose, who graduated from San Diego State University with his bachelor's in kinesiology in 2010 and earned his doctorate in physical therapy from the University of Miami in 2014. Kyle specializes in a manual medicine approach called Counterstrain and earned his Strain Counterstrain certification from the Jones Institute in 2017. 10 years ago, he took his first Counterstrain course and quickly realized the power of the technique through the successful treatment of his patients' symptoms and the alleviation of pain they experienced. Kyle believes in the power of manual therapy and approaches his patients' pain by understanding the relevant anatomy, its blood supply, its drainage, and its innervation from the nervous system. The Counterstrain approach allows him to diagnose and treat the major systems of your body that are causing pain, dysfunction, and dysregulation. Kyle, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So this is one of those techniques that I get asked about it on occasion. And as I was telling you at the beginning, I have no idea how to explain this. It is one of the most unique and fascinating manual manipulation approaches that I've seen. So maybe we can kind of just go to the beginning. Where did this strain counterstrain idea come from? What were its origins?
Yeah, so the technique was developed by an osteopathic doctor. His name was Dr. Jones. He was like a old country osteopath from Oregon. And in his roots, he was a manipulator, much like what like probably most people are common for with like chiropractic manipulations. That was his main form of intervention. And so he had a patient come in. That patient had psoasitis, which is a spastic contraction of the psoas major muscle. And that patient couldn't stand completely straight without severe pain. So he'd walk around kind of hunched over. Whenever he'd come into Dr. Jones' practice, he'd come in hunched over. So that patient had seen a couple of chiropractors previously that tried to manipulate him and weren't able to kind of get the clinical results they were looking for. So he ended up in Dr. Jones's office, where Dr. Jones kind of coyly thought that, well, I'm an osteopath. I'm a better manipulator than these chiropractors. So let me manipulate you and I'll fix you. So he worked on him maybe 3-4 times. It didn't help. The guy was still in just as bad a shape as he was in the beginning. So finally, the patient comes in and he tells Dr. Jones, if I could just find a comfortable position to sleep in, I think that like at least I'd be able to start trying to heal.
Right.
So Dr. Jones said, okay, well, let's try that. Laid him down and bent his legs up this way, side bent him that way, rotated him this way. And they were able to find a position that the patient was comfortable in. And so Dr. Jones told him, all right, stay there. I'm going to go work on a different patient and then I'll come back and check on you. So he came back maybe 20 minutes later and found the patient asleep. He kind of gently woke the patient up, carefully brought him out of the position, stood him up, and the patient stood up again, or stood up completely straight for the first time in months. So that was the kind of light bulb that there's something to spontaneous release happening from a position. And then it took Dr. Jones maybe 40 or so years from that spontaneous event in 1955 to develop around 200 or so techniques that we call strain and counterstrain.
So what you're alluding to here is that it's not this chiropractic manipulation in the sense of we're just going to adjust something. It's actually just sort of softly putting the body into a position, and there's this natural release. There's this body wisdom that starts to happen when that position is sort of held, and then what happens there? Like how do we explain this idea of sort of the body releasing and just sort of magic happening, really?
Yeah. So what sets counterstrain apart from other techniques is that it's indirect in nature.
Right.
So indirect is assessing a tissue barrier, assessing a dysfunction moving a tissue in one direction and realizing it does not want to go that way. Right. So direct techniques, we would push into that barrier, right? We'd manipulate through it quickly, or we'd mobilize into it, or we stretch through it. Counterstrain is the opposite. So we assess that same barrier, but then we move the tissue via either body positioning or tissue glides the opposite direction. So one of the best kind of common analogies that I can come up with is when you're packing your suitcase to go on a trip, you're shoving all your clothes in there and you're pushing it down and you're trying to zip it up, right? And inevitably it gets caught somewhere. So a direct technique would be trying to just pull through that restriction, versus with counterstrain, we go backwards, right? We let things line up, let things clear out, and then we can progress forward to completely zip up the suitcase. So very generally speaking, that's the indirect paradigm, right? To go backwards, to go forwards. As far as the pathophysiology of, or the physiologic rationale for the technique, that definitely gets into kind of a more complex conversation. The current developer of fascial counterstrain that's really pushing this technique forward has developed the diagnostic cranial scan for fascial counterstrain, and has developed a system-based approach with over 800 new techniques now for the visceral system, the arterial system, the venous lymphatic system. He's actually now a published author in Frontiers. I can send you that article where he's put together the physiologic rationale for counterstrain as far as what we're doing and the impact that we're having in the tissue, but also in a way to describe chronic pain. So really, really cool article, really kind of big accomplishment that a clinician's been able to do to get published in a research article like that. But there's two major things that are happening when we go indirect. One is we're silencing the nociceptive output and the proprioceptive output of those tissues. We're silencing that message that's being sent to the central nervous system, right? So in the body, there's always there's a resting tone, right? So receptors that are in any given tissue will constantly be communicating via like a frequency, let's say, to the central nervous system, like, hey, this is where I am. This is how much tension is going through me. This is where, I'm located in space. So it'll send out like a beep, 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 beep frequency, right? If that tissue starts to get stretched or tension starts to get put through it, that frequency increases. It'll go beep, 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 beep. When we slacken it, we're basically zeroing that out, right? So tissue that's aberrantly tense or inappropriately tense will be sending out this high firing frequency message to the central nervous system, which is inappropriate. So in order to kind of zero that out, hit the reset button on it, we have to slacken the tissue to slow that messaging. Also, and sort of the more powerful part of what we do in an indirect position is we allow for the venous and lymphatic system to drain the interstitium.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That's a big one. And so that does a number of things, but chemical irritation that's stuck in the interstitial tissue or stuck in the lymphatic system acts as a chemical irritant to our receptors. So it could be to pain receptors, it could be to proprioceptors, but it's there pissing them off, right? So the only way to kind of vascularly decompress that area is to drain that fluid full of inflammatory chemicals and chemical waste, cellular garbage, to get it to drain out of that tissue. So that's why with counterstrain, we hold, right? We're going to put you in a position, we're going to move the tissue into a position that we're going to hold you there for 45 to 60 seconds or so, versus these other manipulations that are quick, right? Like chiropractic manipulation being one, for example, that's really fast, right? Real quick HVLA, that works really well on the proprioceptive system, but it doesn't allow for that time for tissue to drain.
Yeah, this really is it's a young technique, right? It's still very much in discovery mode, right? As you kind of alluded to, sort of the pioneer is still kind of charging forward. And I know all of you who are sort of the leading experts in this field are still kind of learning, right? And yet it's not, you're still finding tons of success. Like the baseline has been set. And now it's like, okay, what can we learn from here, right? And it sounds like, and we've had a number of conversations, and for just to kind of let everybody in on this, like I've seen Kyle a number of times. He's just down the road from me, and it's really how I learned about this technique. And we've had a lot of conversations about just the things that you're learning and that you can pass on to others. And there's kind of this small group of sort of expert practitioners and teachers in this space that are really pioneering this and continuing to learn. I want to give people a sense for what this method is, because it's very strange, and I say that lovingly. First of all, it's beautiful because I can go in there and actually kind of fall asleep, and for the most part. I took my infant in there, my 1-year-old in there, and got some manipulation done for him. So it's really broad spectrum in that way. But the most fascinating part in my mind is that as I'm laying down on the table, perhaps, or even sitting, you're able to diagnostically sort of feel my skull, right? You're using your hands in very subtle ways, and you're kind of you're moving and tweaking and kind of just gently touching the skull. And you're able to find these, from my perspective, the layman's perspective, you're able to find these little pain points in my head from my skull. And you somehow you know where they're at. They particularly sort of, and they're not really painful. It's just a slight irritant, like, and you're able to find it. And you go, oh, does that hurt? And I'm like, yeah, it hurts, you know? And then from there, you're able to figure out which part of the body, and this goes beyond just the structure, right? You're going into it, as you mentioned, as I mentioned in the intro, the venous system, the lymphatics, right? The internal organs, all kinds of fascia. And you're able to feel through my skull which system is out of balance, or blocked or stuck. And then you somehow know where to move my leg to unlock something in my, lung area, right? Like it's wild to me. And I feel, as someone who has a pretty good grasp on anatomy and physiology, I feel like I'm in the twilight zone when it comes to the work that you do. And I'm sure Kyle gets a little frustrated or a little annoyed when I come in because I ask a million questions, because it's so mind blowing to me how he's able to do this. And then on the back end of this sort of 1 hour treatment, I'm able to find relief. Things are moving, things are draining. Sometimes I'll even get like headaches or something, or be extra tired that day. So things are moving through, and so I know it's working. So anyway, I just wanted to paint that picture. Maybe you can elucidate what's really going on and what you're doing and how that really works.
Yeah. So there's a couple of pretty significant selling points for the technique from a patient standpoint and from a practitioner standpoint. One you kind of hinted towards already, that you can kind of fall asleep on the table, or it can be done on babies or elderly, and that's the technique is really non-painful.
Yeah.
And going back to kind of the indirect terminology that I used earlier, that's the reason why, is because we're not going into barriers and trying to break through them, but we're going into positions of comfort, right? We're moving tissue into the direction that the body wants it to go. So that's a great kind of part of the technique. Now, with that said, there are diagnostic points in the body. Some of them are tender points in skeletal muscle, on cartilage, on bone, and then some of them are in the head. And those diagnostic tender points, because there is inflammation in that local tissue, right? There's chemical irritants to the nociceptors there, they're pissed off. So when we hit those, you can feel it, right? The patient can feel, yeah, that hurts, right? And even in the first couple of treatments, I'll show my patients where these tender points are by using a slightly pain-provoking pressure that kind of makes them jump. So they go, oh yeah, that one hurts.
That's it.
Right?
Yeah. But it's not so bad, right? I just want to paint that picture that it's like, it's just enough to where you're hitting the spot. And like, oh yeah,
right.
That's interesting. Like what's
it's
that?
enough
right?
that something's there, right?
And it's not typically a point. Sometimes it is, right? Where it's a point where the patient comes in and they know where the spot is that's really tender. But oftentimes when I'm in there, you're finding these random spots in my body that I'm like, it's not really tender until you put your finger right on that exact spot and just apply a tiny bit of pressure.
Right. Yeah. They're very specific, right? Very specific points. Yeah. So most of the time, I would say 90% of the points that I find on patients, they're like, I didn't even know that one was there.
Yeah.
And it's because those points are creating dysfunctions that are referring pain to the location that they're feeling it, right?
Say that again.
Those tender points, those
Yeah.
diagnostic points, like we'll have some like on the anterior surface of the rib cage, right?
Right.
So those points there, they may be causing like diffuse posterior thoracic pain,
Wow.
right? So
They are the direct cause of pain in different parts of the body.
of pain in the back, right?
Wow.
The patients come in aware of where their pain is, right? But there are multiple tender points, tens, maybe even hundreds of tender points all over the body that could be contributing to that pain.
Got it.
So we can go find those points. So yeah, it's a momentary experience of pain when we find a tender point, and it's for a reason. It's so that I can show the patients to see that hurts.
Yep.
And then when I do my release, I can recheck that point, and within 45 seconds, it's gone.
Yeah, that's the most wild part, and again, I'll go back to the head because I think it's so fascinating that you're able to manipulate, just feel around the skull and get these really interesting tender points, and then go move my, right leg over and twist it over and just hold it there in a specific position. And then for 30 seconds, and I'm again, just relaxed in this whole scenario. And then we'll kind of set the leg back down. You'll go back and check that point. And there's no pain, there's no sensitivity whatsoever. And I think one of the reasons too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the reasons I can fall asleep in this process, even though there's some manipulation going on, is because as you're going through this, I'm starting to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, right? The parasympathetics are starting to come online, and all the sympathetic sort of tone starts to dial down. And it just kind of like, it's almost like when you go lay in the sun, you just kind of naturally start to fall asleep, right? It's just this total relaxation as this is going on.
Yeah, certainly each dysfunction that we treat is, a kind of a microsympathetic, response or upregulation in the body. So as we eliminate those dysfunction by dysfunction, your body, we're not only ramping down sympathetic, but we're facilitating your body's ability to go into parasympathetic mode, which is where kind of all the magic happens for restoration, detox, and healing to occur. So that's why too, you said post-treatment, you may kind of have those experiences where you take a 2-hour nap after a treatment because your body is saying like, hey, that was good. We just went into parasympathetic mode. We have a window to heal. Go to sleep.
Right, totally.
Right? Because that's when our lymphatic system, the lymphatic system of our central nervous system, all these detox healing processes are most active, is in that parasympathetic state.
Yeah, and you mentioned the interstitium earlier, right? And recently this has sort of been classified officially as an organ now, right? Which is really interesting that we're still discovering organs in the body. But this interstitium serves a really, really valuable, multiple functions, of course, but two of them is to shuttle nutrients into the tissues, right? And then shuttle waste product out, right? Whether it's the sort of metabolic waste and biologic waste that's natural through metabolism, as well as any chemicals and toxins, so to speak, that end up in the body. And this is one of the issues that I find is people are trying to do detox protocols, right? They might be doing some kind of cleansing through the GI tract. They might be doing some sort of advanced liver detoxification, upregulating, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 detox in the liver. They might even be doing some lymphatic stuff, right? And that's all fantastic. But I find that if we can't shuttle things in and out through the interstitium and get them into the lymphatic system, right, then we're kind of, at best, we just don't make much headway, right? Yeah, there's a lot of stuckness. And so this is what I've really, really found beneficial is through techniques like Counterstrain, through things like, rolfing even can be beneficial. Fascial decompression, the block therapy that we had Deanna Hansen on, things to really get into that sort of the soft tissue, and really being able to remove adhesions and get flow going on at that interstitial level becomes really, really critical to repair and heal.
Yeah. And the reality that interstitium is within every tissue in the body, right? So even veins have interstitium that needs to be drained via their own veins, right? So that interstitial fluid, and space is everywhere. And it does, like you said, it contains very normal things. It has a job to do, and the waste products that are in it are normal. They're supposed to be there. But the lymphatic system has to be, able to do its job of draining that interstitial fluid out, along with all, the proteins and the cytokines and interleukin 6s, to decompress, to chemically decompress that tissue.
So with Counterstrain, is this something, that we're always chasing symptoms, right? I imagine a lot of people come in with various pains. That's probably a majority of your clients. Is it something where, they come in with pain and you do your thing and they leave, they feel good, and then they come back with pain, the same pain a couple of weeks later? Like what is the evolution of a patient's journey when they come to see you?
Yeah, my treatments, I'll kind of talk for myself here. My treatments, when I work with patients, are certainly directed at their pain complaints.
Yeah.
So if they come in for back pain, that is going to be my ultimate goal, is to help them with their back pain, right? Now, with that said, this is a good kind of segue back into the cranial scan conversation. I use that cranial scan to dictate my treatment, right? My goal with each patient is to clear their cranial scan of dysfunction. If I do the cranial scan and I find that everything is negative, then I believe that I've created an environment in that patient's body for which they can now function and heal under. So even if after like 2, 3, 4 visits, that patient is not pain-free, if their cranial scan's negative, I feel good about their body continuing to heal even without seeing me continually.
You're setting the conditions for their success, which may take some time, and of course, them doing the right things, and right, there's sort of responsibility on them to, after you kind of clear them, right? And then of course, we all end up, we're living life, right? So things start to go awry again, and then we can come back in, and there may be sort of a new set of dysfunctions and blockages when they come in again, right? But I would imagine for most of us, especially as we get older, we start to see some repetition in some of the systems that kind of get blocked and that need some help.
Sure. And we're getting into like the conversation of dysfunction and what is dysfunction and how do dysfunctions get created. And certainly, yeah, we're living life. So we have stress, we have repetitive movements, we have postural strain, all these different things that can create dysfunction with our own body. But when a patient is there with pain, with shoulder pain or pathology or disease, it's because there's been dysfunction unaddressed over time, which has led to that state, right? So, for someone in their 50s who has back pain, as long as there's not like severe pathology, like cervical stenosis or disc herniations, or they're on their second lumbar fusion, we should be able to clear enough dysfunction to significantly help them. And I would not expect to see them back anytime soon for those same complaints.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I love about Counterstrain is that it can be used as a preventative tool, right? So yes, definitely come in when things are going awry, but schedule an appointment with you and just getting things checked up, right? And because the reality is that things are always in a state of flux, right? I mean, the body's doing its best to maintain dynamic homeostasis, but things don't always happen like we want them to, and things get stuck, and so we need to it helps to have manual manipulation to help kind of keep moving things back into balance, back into homeostasis. And so I find it's really interesting. You're one of the few practitioners that I've come in and worked with, and your goal was to actually not see me again, right? For that thing, right? To actually get me out of the treatment for the thing that I come in for. And I really, really appreciate that about this technique. And I find that, with something like this, it may be one of the more advanced tools to prevent long-term dysfunction. As you stated, this repetitive kind of dysfunctional state that ends up leading to some pathology, right? And if we can interrupt that process from going from healthy to pathology, we can interrupt that in between. Makes a huge difference.
I mean, one of the coolest things that I get to do is have patients that come back in anywhere from monthly to quarterly for a wellness visit. They come in and I ask them how their body's feeling, and their complaints where before severe pain here, moderate pain here, limiting pain here. Now it's like, I feel a little tight in this area. If I lift my shoulder up, I just feel a little tightness here, but otherwise I'm feeling good. Yeah. Right. So in those patients, I can go to the cranial scan, assess them, kind of treat some of the low-hanging fruit that maybe did reoccur, from their previous visits, but then start kind of working on new stuff, like going into like the deeper anatomy that I study, and trying to manipulate those tissues and seeing what other dysfunctions they have. That it's I'm blanking on the word now, but it's not currently creating any symptoms, but it is there. And if we can clear that, then we can kind of keep extending that state of wellness. Certainly we talk about preventative treatment in not only high-level athletes, but just in kind of slowing or delaying the aging process.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the main theory there is that if we can maintain perfusion throughout joints and throughout tissues, then that tissue is going to remain healthy regardless of how much we're using it.
Right. Yeah. That blood flow is key, right? The blood flow to, and then the waste removal out, right? Especially when it comes to joints, right? That have a sort of lack of blood flow there, that synovial flow. We need to get things still moving. And so how does your technique actually address things like joints and that synovial fluid? Because usually they say, motion is lotion, and we got to get movement, manual movement with the knee or the shoulder or the elbow, what have you. How does Counterstrain address that?
Well, manual movement is just trying to facilitate fluid movement.
Right.
Right. But any paradigm that we have is a multi-system approach. So, if we talk about a specific joint like the knee, for instance, within the Counterstrain paradigm, we have releases for the joint capsule of the knee. We have releases for periosteal releases for the femur, for the tibia, for the patella. We can release the sympathetic nerves that innervate the vessels that supply blood and drain the knee.
Wow.
We can release the somatic nervous system that innervates the joint capsule. We can release the arteries, and we can release the veins and lymphatic vessels. So in doing that, we can recreate this state of homeostasis around the knee where tension is normal and perfusion is optimal. And in that state, things function well, heal well, and don't degenerate. As soon as inflammation and fluid stasis builds up in the knee, then what it does is it dirties the synovial fluid, right? And that fluid is a lubricant in the joint, but any lubricant that becomes dirtied becomes an adhesive, right? So we're keeping that synovial fluid clean by making perfusion optimal.
Well, this gets back to the kind of the core of what healing is, right? I mean, I have a young one, and I know you do too. And it's really fascinating to watch him skin his knee or get injured or even get sick. I mean, the healing response is like, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, how fast his skin heals, his wounds heal, is just truly mind blowing, right? And we know that young people have greater levels of stem cells. They have more peptide release, right? And the healing response is unquestionably better when we are in our super youthful state like that. The science is very clear on that. However, as we get older, right, we still want the optimal healing response that I can produce, right? And so this is what I find is interesting, and I think there's a paradigm that we sort of consciously or unconsciously hold on to within the health world, which is one side says, oh, the body, it knows how to heal. It can do its thing, right? Like, you trust the body. And I'm firmly in that camp. And there's the other side that says, well, no, we've got to do stuff to it, right? We got to give it supplements. We got to give it all the things, right? And within that, sometimes there's a distrust of the fundamental biology, right? That I know better than the body. And I find that there's a beautiful sort of combination of the two, right? Which is that, yes, the body does know exactly how to heal, and we need to give it the right scenario, the right circumstances to do what it knows how to do. But if we don't, then it's going to struggle to do that, right? And that seems to be where Counterstrain comes in, is that it's really setting that container for the body, however old, to heal as optimally as it can in the given scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly see myself in kind of my patient's journey in healing simply as a facilitator.
Yeah.
Right? And my goal is not to get them out of pain, but it's to create an environment within their body, within that tissue that's traumatized and inflamed, for it to be able to heal it, right? It's not that difficult to make people feel good temporarily. And that's a fragile state to be in, because they can very easily re-irritate that tissue and slip back into the inflammatory cycle and back into pain. But healed is strong, right? If that tissue's healed again, then it's durable. It can withstand some strain again. And that's what's going to get them back into activity and participating in recreation or lifestyle things. So,
yeah. Well, I knew.
Healing.
I wish more people knew about Counterstrain. I know Tony Robbins wrote about it in his recent book, Life Force, and I'm sure that's kind of exploded you guys a little bit because he's got such a big platform. And yet still, I find that it's not really all that known. And I think it's got nowhere to go but up from here as more people experience it. And I think my hope is that not only will people go to Counterstrain specialists for pain and physical issues, but they start to go for detoxification purposes, right? I mean, somebody's got mold that they're working through, right? What a beautiful addition to that therapy, which is to help things move and flow and detoxify and get out of the system, right? Like this is where I think it can come in. In fact, this is probably, in my opinion, my favorite part about Counterstrain is that it can get into these sort of soft tissue aspects, right? All the various systems of the body. That's what's so fascinating, that you can get in there with pinpoint like precision and address those various systems. That's truly unique in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. And, we've talked about, pain and joints a little bit, but the same kind of paradigm is true for the visceral system, for, organs that are responsible for detoxing or for immune response. So kidneys, liver, spleen, they all have autonomic innervation from the sympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic nervous system. They have arteries, they have veins, they have suspensory ligaments that anchor them to the musculoskeletal system. And all of these things need to be optimal, be functioning at the highest efficiency possible in order for them not only to function well and do their job in a detox situation, but also to prevent disease in those organs too. And we've certainly seen people with low level organ pathology that's progressive. We've seen it start to stop. The progression has been slowed and then eventually stopped. And I believe that the body is capable of even bringing those organs back to a higher functioning state as well. But the environment has to be created. And that's what Counterstrain can do from an applied anatomy paradigm.
Yeah. And again, this is where I think, no matter what the disease state, no matter what the labeled condition, whether it's cancer, autoimmune conditions, mast cell activation syndrome, right? There's all these sort of various conditions that people might suffer from, kidney issues, right? And this is the thing with a lot of these organ systems that may not be functioning optimally. In integrative medicine, integrative health, we've only got a few things that we can do, right? We can supply supplements to try to help facilitate, right? Herbs are very good. But that's really kind of an allopathic aspect, really, of function, right? And I'm a fan of using that stuff. But we've had Ashok Gupta who does limbic retraining, these type of things, right? That's more fundamental, and this is where I think is really interesting. Things like limbic retraining and Counterstrain that gets into the autonomics that can help reset that tone that really communicates to the entire system, right? There's not a lot of techniques I know that can go in and improve splenic function, right? And it's like, how do we know when these things aren't functioning? Well, we don't have tests for them. In all of functional medicine, we don't have very good tests for a lot of these things, right? So how do we know if the appendix is doing its job to the best of its ability, right? The real way to get there is through the autonomics, right? Is through these internal systems, getting them back into their optimal state and allowing the body to sort of reset itself and trust the wisdom that it's going to do just that.
Yeah. And the cool thing is that you don't have to have disease to have dysfunction within, any of those organs, right? You don't have to have liver cirrhosis to have a hepatic artery dysfunction.
Right.
Right.
Well, I've gone in there a few times to you and you just point out these random things that are going on. I'm like, no kidding. Right. And this is, one of the things that I do is sort of go investigate at health to the degree that I can with the functional tests that I know about, but we can't check for that. Right. And so when I go in there, and this may be a temporary state that just sort of ignited or just got caught or stuck or blocked maybe a week ago, right? And so
Sure.
this is one of those things too that is difficult with some of the testing out there, the laboratory testing, is that you're not going to be, running $1,000 worth of lab tests every week or every other week. And yet I can go and see you and get a checkup and see what's going on every other week and figure out what's blocked, what's out of balance, what's stuck, what we need to work on, right? So it's really interesting in that way to get a better picture in real time.
And I think that is one of the coolest things about the technique is that through the cranial scan and through the diagnostic tender points, I'm able to tell you within really it's just a few minutes kind of what dysfunctions you have, what systems they're predominantly in, and kind of what the clinical impact of them might be if we don't treat them. Right? We just left this dysfunction here for another 20 years, what that might look like, right? Because it's changing the kind of degenerative process of that tissue by not having adequate oxygen and nutrition through the arterial system, or by not being able to drain via the venous lymphatic system.
Yeah, and everything's connected, right? So it's like it's not only that system and that organ or what have you, but it's that's going to be putting pressure on a bunch of other systems as well. So it's the complexity is really hard to trace, and so again, that's why it's so important to just find the dysfunction, find those tender points, and start to reset things. And I think if I didn't experience this, I'd probably think it's suspect. But what I find that's really easy there's two things to make it easy to buy in. One is the fact that you're able to find these tender points on my skull and elsewhere in my body. And then you're able to correlate that with another point in my body that's tender. And so for you to be able to sort of guess at this is pretty impossible. So you have an unbelievable ability to feel and recognize what's going on. And then after these very subtle manipulations, the impact is noticeable, right? It's really, really wild to experience how impactful it is. And so, Kyle, I could chat with you for a while, as he knows when I come in, that's kind of what I do. But tell people more where they can find some more of this information. I know is there a resource where people can, if they want to go find a specialist, how can they do that?
Yeah, so we have a few different resources out there. One is jicounterstrain.com, and that is the teaching institute that I am the director of, where we teach these courses around the country, and then partner with institutes around the world. And on our website there, we do have a directory where you can punch in your zip code and kind of a radius, and you can see which of our students might be in your geographic area. There's another website called Counterstrain.com, and they have a practitioner lookup as well, where you can look at a map and see which practitioners might be close to you. Both of those websites are great resources for more information. The Frontiers article that Brian Tuckey wrote, for those of you that are interested in the kind of physiologic rationale of the technique, that's a great read at understanding fluid stasis and how fluid stasis is a primary cause for not only pain, but for disease progression. And then, we have our socials too. We can always get more activity on those and more people following us on those to help spread Counterstrain. Our goal is to use our institutes as a vehicle to help as many people as possible that are in pain. Our reach as individual practitioners is only so far, so we want to train more and more medical professionals in these techniques so we can help more people.
Well, I definitely think this is one of those techniques that will be alive and well in the future, and it's only going to grow, in my opinion, as the exposure grows. So if there's anybody that's a massage therapist or a chiropractor, anybody in the manual manipulation area, I would highly suggest looking into this technique and becoming a practitioner if that sounds interesting, because we need more of this. And it really, and while there is a science to it clearly, and there's methods that can be taught, it's also a feel, right? It's very much in that sort of artwork aspect where the practitioner has a feel for this stuff, which in my opinion, I do fall in love with those techniques because it really brings the human into the equation, right? It's not just this sort of robotic method. And there's some brilliance and genius that can come through with these type of techniques. And so if anybody's in the San Diego area, definitely look up Kyle. He's got a very busy practice. Sometimes it's hard to get in, but it's definitely worth scheduling if you can, and getting in there, because it's a game changer. So Kyle, thanks for joining me, and appreciate you sharing the message.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Before we kick off the next interview, please let me know in the comment section below what you think of today's presentations. I'd love to hear what has impacted you most and what some of your biggest takeaways have been. I'll be reading and responding to your comments below, so let's chat. Well, I'm so thrilled to announce my next guest. She has an amazing integrative pet practice, veterinary medicine. And the reason this becomes critical and important to share is because they're using technology that applies not only to pets, but to humans. Dr. Marlene Siegel has been a veterinarian for nearly 40 years, with the last 20 plus years practicing integrative medicine. She's an international speaker and an innovator in integrative veterinary medicine. Her practice, Pasco Veterinary Medical Center in Lutz, Florida, offers the widest array of alternative therapies and detoxification services in the country. She developed her own raw pet food company, and supplements evoloveраw.com. Passionate about education, she has online programs for pet parents and veterinarians to teach integrative vet medicine. Dr. Siegel, thanks for joining me.
I am so honored to be here, Jason.
Well, I was blown away by some of the case studies that you have shared with me about with the pets that you've worked with, and some of the technologies and the therapies. And of course, the dietary changes that you implement with your pet parents and with their pets. And I thought it was so unbelievable that it's worth sharing here. Even though this isn't a pet conference or a pet summit, it still applies to humans. So maybe you can talk to me about that a little bit before we get into your background in veterinary medicine. Talk to me about what you're seeing, because you're not only treating pets, somehow the humans are coming along for the ride.
Oh, absolutely. And I think over the past 40 years, we've seen a big shift in the relationship between people and their pets. You know, pets, we've always loved our pets, but the pets of today are not just a family member. They're actually soul pets. And they're taking people on a journey where I think we all need to go, which is an elevated position. We need to be more conscious and awakened. And it's interesting that people will do things for their pets that they would not have done for themselves. But in the quest to heal their pet, they're making those lifestyle changes, and then they're applying it to themselves. So we're not only healing the pets, we're helping the people to awaken and heal themselves, when ultimately it heals the planet as well.
Absolutely. And this is an interesting aspect, right? Because there's all these technologies out there that we're learning about and hearing about. And there's some stuff out there that just doesn't work very well, in my opinion. I've tried a lot of this stuff, and it's hard to tell what works for the broader population and what might work for me. The cool thing about using these technologies and this advanced therapies on pets is that there's no placebo effect. In other words, they're perfect test subjects, if we want to think of them that way, that they prove out some of this stuff, and they really show us what's possible. So I guess with that said, how did you sort of wander into this very advanced integrative world, coming from sort of the veterinary side of things?
Well, you know, I think all of us have that journey where something really profound happens in our life that is life transforming. And for me, it involved one of my horses, who was one of our show horses with my daughter in the show arena, had an accident, and the horse literally saved my daughter's life. When I went to get help for the horse, because I don't typically do equine medicine, I'm a small animal practitioner, those infamous words were, "Dr. Siegel, we really don't know what's wrong with Lily, but we can tell you that she's not going to ever be safe to ride. She'll never be shown again. And your two options are, you can put her out to a pasture or you can put her down." And it was that mindset that they had no other options for me. It was, yeah, put her out to a pasture or kill her. Really? And I just knew in my heart that that wasn't an adequate answer. It wasn't enough. And so I realized that They just didn't know the answer, and I didn't know what it was either, but I was sure going to find it. And that took me on a journey looking outside of the Western toolkit, which is what we were all trained in. So I didn't know there was this other world out there, but as I started to leave my world of allopathic medicine and enter into this more expanded world, I realized that there's a place for both. So it's not an all one or the other, it's an and. So when we can take the great technologies that we've developed in today's modern world and blend that with the technologies that are geared at finding the root cause of the problem and understand the biology of the body, which we are not trained in. So as I started having great mentors, Dr. Zach Bush, Dr. Chris Shade, those are mentors of mine who helped me to really understand what biology means. And so now what I do is I look for the root cause, which is super simple. And then I see where in that biological pathway can we either enhance or stop inhibiting, or how do we just let the body go back and do what it needs to do? So all the technologies that I have incorporated and all of the supplements I've incorporated are all designed to affect some part of that metabolic function. So the body ultimately goes back and can do what it's supposed to do.
I love that. And you know, when it comes to pets, I don't want to say they're simple because they have complex emotions and they're very complex in itself, but they're maybe not as complex as us. In other words, we get in our own way a lot, and the pets tend to not do that so much, right? And so,
Yeah.
so that's what I love, is that if we just give them the right circumstances, the right environment, then things can radically shift, right? We can see amazing healing. And so, again, for anybody who doesn't have a pet and maybe thinking, why do I want to hear this talk? There's some amazing things that I think we can learn. And you've got some really cool case studies that we're going to look at, and some of the technologies that you're using as well. That, again, I think what's really important about this is that we can look at this and say, okay, that worked for this pet. Could it work for us humans? And the answer is obviously yes, right? And so a lot of this stuff was developed sort of, I think, for humans first, and then we've applied it to pets. And then some of this stuff is really being used on pets more, I think. And then we can actually use it for us and take that as a case study for ourselves. And so so maybe let's jump into some of these case studies, because this is what's really fascinating. Again, when I saw this stuff, I mean, not only was the emotion just overwhelming, right? Because some of these pets are in horrible shape, and to see them recover is just truly remarkable. But it opened my eyes even further just to what the power of some of these technologies.
And your point is well taken. And I want people to understand that these were all technologies that were initially established for humans. And then I've adapted the protocols to use them on animals. And interestingly enough, almost every technology I have can be used by a homeowner. So the pet owner can actually purchase these. Now, it's not going to say that everybody's going to go out and spend $150,000 on each piece of equipment, but it is available and it actually is affordable. So if they work with a knowledgeable practitioner, and they're welcome to call me, I can help guide them as to what is it that they need the most, so they make their investment wisely. Or when we open our franchises, which is spas, family wellness centers, they'll be able to go to a wellness center and receive the therapies with their pet.
Beautiful. Cool. Well,
Right, well, let's
share
jump
your
in.
screen. Yeah.
Okay, so let's just, take a second to really look at statistics, because I don't know that people really appreciate that the cancer rates in dogs right now are the highest of any mammal on the planet, 1 out of 1.65. So that is literally almost 100% of dogs will get cancer in their lifetime, and it is not an old dog disease. These are animals under 2 years of age as well. Cats, they say, is 1 out of 3. I think that's highly underreported. And then if you include obesity, autoimmune disease, arthritis, allergies, or some form of gastrointestinal disease, we are literally seeing 100% of our animals having some type of chronic degenerative disease. Worse, life expectancy is down by 7 years. Now think about that, Jason. With all of this advanced medical technology, our pets are living 7 years shorter than they did 20 years ago.
And this just highlights the lifestyle components of both our diseases and our pets' disease, right? We can no longer look at genetics and say it's the genes, because it's happening to our domesticated pets as well at much higher rates than it's happening in the wild, right? So there's something about the way they're living, and I know you know a lot about this, and we'll cover some of this, but it's massive.
Yeah, only 5% is attributed to genetics. 95% is epigenetics. So this is the 6 keys. And Like you said, this applies to everybody. This is the lifestyle I live to be able to stay healthy. And I'm in my mid 60s. So I am not willing to age ungracefully. I don't mind aging, but I'm going to do it gracefully and be happy and healthy until the time I decide to transition. So step number one is we have to stop polluting the body. And there's just no shortcut. I know we've been sold on fast, cheap, and convenient, but we have to stop doing the things that are causing the disease so that the disease can go away. Supplying the essential nutrients. We know our foods are being grown on nutrient depleted soils. So if we don't supplement, even if it's grown organically, we're not going to have the nutrients that our body needs to run these biological pathways. You have to heal the gut, no shortcut. And then detoxification, which is one of my passions, and that's the kidney, the colon, the lungs, the liver, the skin, and the lymphatics. We have to allow these organs to do their job, and they're just so bogged down in today's environment. Mitochondria can't survive without them. They produce our energy and they create the communication network between themselves and our microbiome to tell our metabolic pathways what to turn on and what to turn off. And then last but not least is clearing the trapped emotions that we know is associated with all dis-ease.
And what I love about this, Marlene, is that you're proving the model, right? So this is a model of integrative medicine. Forget pets or fish or humans, or it doesn't matter, right? Like this is the model that we must follow because we're living in this sort of similar worlds, right? And so if we could, if in other words, if you can prove this model on pets, then there's no reason to think that I can't prove this model on a human as well. And of course, many people are doing this. And so I just love that you're proving the same model.
Thank you. And what I try to do is make it easy and implementable, because the two reasons people fail is a lack of knowledge and a lack of being able to implement all this knowledge that they learn. So when we break it out into a little step-by-step pathway, it makes it easy to pick one thing at a time to start to integrate, and it makes it easy and sustainable. So this is the first piece of instrument that we always start with. It's a pulse electromagnetic frequency machine called a Magnosphere. But the biggest difference between this machine and any other technology that is out there in the world right now is we operate in the picotesla ranges. So our body emits frequencies that are in the picotesla range. They're very, very tiny. Most of the PMF devices that are out there are 1,000,000 times stronger frequencies, and they become an interruptive frequency. So initially you may feel a change, but you don't fix anything. Our goal is, can we get into a parasympathetic state, and can we take and entrain those tissues back to the normal frequency that they're supposed to resonate at? And that is really the crux of what we need to do. We need to repair what is dysresonant and make it resonant again. So that's our first instrument. It's a really cool device, and this is available for homeowners as well. And then we use full spectrum infrared. Now the sun is a full spectrum infrared device, but we don't stay out in the sun like our ancestors did. Our pets didn't live indoors back in the day, but today we are all light deficient because we are not out in the sun. And the infrared rays that come through change from morning to midday to evening. So being able to simulate that in full spectrum technology. On the left is my kitty cat, Louie. As soon as we put our pad down, the first thing he did is jump on it. They love these frequencies. And then we have, of course, the sauna that you can get in, and Shikari is in the center. She was one of our cancer patients, and she's getting her sauna. And then on the right-hand side are the portable units, which I will tell you, it is not the funnest thing to have an animal on your lap while you're sweating. So for the animals, we use the pads more than anything else. And then structuring water, my gosh, we could spend a whole lecture and more talking about structured water, but the water in our body is structured. So trust me on that one for now, guys. And we need to restructure the water that we're taking in. This is a device that it sends out structured water through its mechanisms. So when the pet is in the room, it's being kind of displayed through the whole room. So the pet is breathing in the structured water, which then structures their water inside their body. Assisted lymphatic therapy, oh my gosh, this is one of the most important tools. I think they're all important, but the lymphatic system is the system that produces our immune system, and it's our largest organ for detoxification. So that's how we get stuff out. And almost all of our patients are congested. They're not able to move their lymph properly. So it's a device that produces it's a negative current with these inert gases and ions. So it decongests the areas, and then we open up the different lymphatic ports, and then we're able to sweep the lymphatics into their drainage ports. And we can change the frequency so we can actually target the deep lymphatics, which in manual technologies you can't do. And you can see the kitty cat even likes it in the center. And then we do an ion footpath because we want to be able to get these toxins out of the body. And our large animals, we just put their front feet in, but the little guys, whole body, and they love it. It gets them into another parasympathetic feeling because it helps them to relax, and then it's pulling out a lot of toxins. So you can even see the kitty cats don't mind it. This is our vibration machine. It does vibration and sound therapy. It's the only system of its kind that I'm aware of in the United States. So you can see that they're getting the vibration, and then you can hear the sound. There's over 8,000 frequency programs that we can use. I'm not holding these animals on the device. They actually like it. So here's a smattering of some of the animals that go on there. All of our cases experience this. And this is I have to show you this because this will demonstrate how much nature understands frequency. So these snakes came in, the guy had just bought them. He thought they had a cold. So we decided to put them on the machine, and the little black thing is a cell exciter. It kind of concentrates the frequencies right into a general area. So as I put the cell exciter on the snakes, notice that they're curling up literally underneath the cell exciter. They had the ability, if they didn't like those frequencies, to move away, but they wanted those frequencies. And I had it set for like bacteria, inflammation, stress, and a variety of different things, and they loved it. I'm going to show you what a live blood analysis looks like so that when you see the clinical case, it'll make sense. So these are red blood cells. We put the blood on a slide. We don't stain it. We look at it when it's fresh. And the job of the red blood cell is to pick up oxygen through its cell membrane, deliver that to the tissues, and then to pick up waste material and deliver it out the body. It's a great system. But there are many things that collapse the fourth phase of water that surrounds all of our cells, like electromagnetic frequencies, toxins, glyphosate, all of those collapse that fourth phase of water, and we need it to be expanded. So this is what it looks like when it's collapsed. In veterinary school, Jason, they taught us that this was normal for horses and cats.
Wow.
So not true. But that's all they ever saw. So they thought that must be normal, but it's not.
Right.
So here's ozone therapy. This is something that we use a ton. We can do it intravenously by ozonating blood. We can use it rectally. We can bubble it through oils because you can't breathe ozone straight, but you can breathe the ozonides for lung health. We can give it subcutaneously. We can use it at acupuncture, or we can do it as a lavage. But I'm going to show you what it looks like in the body after rectal application. So on the left is a real patient that came in not feeling good. And you can see the fourth phase of water is collapsed. All the cells are stuck together. This is even pass-through low. It's aggregation. And on the right, that is 10 minutes after rectal ozone. So you can't deny that something changed in that animal. And clinically, he felt 100% better.
Wow.
Hyperbaric oxygen. I'm diving with two of my cancer patients on the left. And on the right, you can see how roomy these chambers are. This is a home chamber. And it's comfortable, it's roomy. You don't, if you get claustrophobic, you may, but most people don't. And it is phenomenal for aiding in detoxification and oxygenation of the body. One of our number one things we use for our cancer patients and our Lyme's patients. Salt therapy, also called halo therapy, wonderful for the entire respiratory tract and for skin, because the therapeutic salt is a desiccant. It's antiviral, antibacterial. It helps to kind of act like a toothbrush, right? So when you're breathing in these micronized particles, it causes all the gook and gunk to break down, and get into a form where you can cough it up or sneeze it out. So all of our cancer patients go in, and you can see my daughter and one of our cats on the left, and then sometimes this pet goes in on the right. This is super important. This is using sound frequency. So this was a very hyper little dog, 6 months old, came in because he didn't feel good. We'd taken x-rays and his back was out of alignment. So I'm going to try to do a chiropractic adjustment, and he goes ballistic, right? He just can't be held. Now we started playing the music. We're 3 minutes into the music. He's already laid down.
He looks
Mama's
tired.
trying to hold him. Look how heavy his eyes are.
Yeah.
He's like really trying to keep his eyes open, and he's yawning. And then about 1 more minute after we were playing the music, he just puts his head down. This is no drugs. This is sound frequency relieving anxiety. But the big test, can we now adjust them? Look at that. Yeah, I can't make that up. This is great.
It's
So
like you
now
just
we can
totally
go-
engaged the parasympathetic. Like you just shut down
Absolutely.
the sympathetic drive.
Absolutely. And I did a ton of live blood studies showing that when they're listening to that frequency, the fourth phase of water expands and they just relax. It's remarkable. First, acupuncture. I always wondered who was the first person that stuck a needle in themselves or their friend. You know, what did that look like? But this is using electrical stem acupuncture. This was a kitty cat that was paralyzed, and within 4 days, we were able to get her walking again. We do crystal fusion light therapy, which is full spectrum light through different gemstones, which is neat because the different gemstones have different qualities. This was ancient technology. The ancient healers would actually take stones of different colors and place them on the person's chest or part of the body and lay them in the full spectrum sun. So
This
we're
is,
just
this is
doing
still
it.
used, yeah, in Ayurveda as color therapy, and they'll usually wear colors and include colors in their day to day to influence different aspects of energy.
It's remarkable because you can warm things up, you can cool things off, you can sedate, you can tonify. It's just remarkable to see the changes. And then this is photo biomodulation. This is where we take low-level light therapy and we can use it intravenously. And I believe this is the only technology that I'm aware of that can be done intravenously. The reason that's important is because the low spectrum colors are absorbed by the melanocytes in our skin, so they don't make it to the red blood cell. But when we're treating cancer, we can give a chemical intravenously like curcumin or vitamin C, and then we can activate it with the color. So now it's not only doing its normal photodynamic therapy like by the product, but now we're making that product even more active. Like vitamin C becomes hundreds-fold more effective. So on the left, the needles are into a joint where this dog had ruptured a cruciate ligament. In the middle is my daughter and I getting a therapy at our friend's cancer clinic in Mexico. I always have to try everything before I give it to my patients. And then they have a shower head, which can be used topically, and you see that on the right. So here are the different colors that we can do with this technology. And because we can bypass the skin, we can go directly into tumors, we can do it into the abdomen, and we can use ultraviolet, blue, green, yellow, red, and infrared. So just a really quick case to show you how effective all of this works. This was a little dog that came into an emergency center with vomiting and diarrhea, super high liver enzymes, but they did not check her lipids, her triglycerides. So when I saw her 6 months later, her lipids, her triglycerides were 2,514, the highest I've ever seen in any animal. And this was her live blood on presentation to me. Now the vomiting and diarrhea had already cleared up, but they didn't address the root cause of her problem. All that bouncy stuff in the back is fat. This dog had been fasted.
Wow.
And still had that much fat. And all her cells are stuck together. So here is 1 hour in the magnosphere. The cells are already separated. The fourth phase of water is expanded. And then this is on day 3. So we treated her day 1, day 2, day 3. Background is clear. We changed her diet. We have her on digestive enzymes. But here's the remarkable part. No drugs. Her triglycerides went from 2,514 down to 125, which is normal range, in 6 days.
And using which technology primarily?
That was primarily the magnosphere.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
So
and then we
EMF.
changed. diet, yeah, and then we changed her diet. So that was showing that the expansion of the fourth phase of water, so those cells can separate, have a tremendous impact on the physiology of the body.
Wow.
And then one more little case, because so many people think that there's nothing more that can be done. This little dog came in with nonstop seizures. We were able to get the seizures controlled with drugs, and this is what she started looking like shortly after we got the major seizure stopped. She still had the nystagmus, the eye twitters, and we asked the owners, no guarantee, what do you want to do? Do you want to euthanize, or do you want us to try and give her 24 hours? They had had a previous dog years ago that they never got over the guilt of giving up too soon. They always wondered if it could have helped.
Mhm.
So they gave us 24 hours to work with her. This is her going home the next day.
No.
Right now, that doesn't mean she lived forever. You know, she had a brain tumor. She had other stuff going on. She had Cushing's disease, but they had more time with this dog to be prepared for when it was time to say goodbye, and they didn't have to do it prematurely.
And you ease the suffering, right? Like, I mean, that's part of, I think,
Quality of
overall-
life,
Yeah.
absolutely, beyond all else, quality of life.
Yeah.
So this is a cancer case, and I chose this one to show because we can see the cancer. So this is Chikari. She had a squamous cell carcinoma in her nose. Look at the left side. And we went through all of our therapies. You see her in the ion foot bath. She's in the sauna. She got her intravenous light therapies and much more, the salt booth, etc. In about 8 weeks, the tumor started really flaring up. And I wanted to point out this particular case because if you want the cancer to go away, it can't stay the same. So the body has to recognize it. It has to do something with it. But we held our ground, we kept going, and in 16 weeks, this dog was cancer-free, and that cancer never came back.
Wow.
This is Beavis. These feral cats that come in with chronic upper respiratory tract infections. In the traditional medical world, these cats become chronic infected and chronic carriers. We did our salt booth therapy, ozone. This is in 24 hours. The discharge was getting less. He was opening her eyes. 72 hours, 3 days.
Wow.
This is a normal cat, no drugs. I got to emphasize, no steroids, no antibiotics. These are viral infections. Even though veterinarians treat this with antibiotics, it's not an antibiotic disease, but they don't have anything else to do.
Right.
So they feel like they have to do something. Totally normal, never relapsed. And he's years into it now and has no chronic problems. And this is just another cat that had real chronic problems with upper respiratory tract disease. He was AIDS positive. We used our salt booth therapy, diet, etc. Here he is in the salt booth with his mama, and mama got better too. He did develop lung cancer, and we kept our therapies going, and he was cancer-free and sinuses-free. It took a few months, but this cat had failed multiple rounds of antibiotics from other hospitals.
Wow.
How cool is that?
That's amazing.
This is Zeke. He had a cruciate ligament, super big problem in today's world. We're seeing tons of dogs with cruciate ruptures. So here he is with a 3-legged walk. Pet owners with a cruciate dog know what that looks like. We did our PRP, which is platelet-rich plasma injections into the knee, along with our light therapy. And this is him walking after surgery. He literally walked home.
Wow.
And stayed that way. Tucker had an osteosarcoma, which is a bone cancer in his leg. We began our therapies here. You can see the hole that's in the bone and all the swelling. Within 2 weeks, he was walking on the leg. And within 3 months, he was radiographically, the bone cancer was healing. We had it evaluated by a board certified radiologist, and he said, either you had a wrong diagnosis or it wasn't an aggressive osteosarcoma. Guys, there is no non-aggressive osteosarcoma. It's one of the most aggressive bone cancers, and this dog was recovering. Lyme's disease, huge problem. This dog came in, had been not diagnosed with Lyme's because by the time they tried to diagnose it, it had already gone intracellular, but we used bioenergetic scanning to actually diagnose him. And we did our therapies on him, and he started out with a white blood cell count of 91,000, super high. And then we got it down to 30,000 and a happy dog. This is a cat that was paralyzed. They went to their vet. that couldn't treat it. They went to a referral center. The referral center said this cat probably had lymphoma, which is a cancer in the spine. They should euthanize. They didn't want to euthanize. A lot of people get paralyzed animals. They'll relate to this particular case. So we began our therapies. We're crab walking in 4 days, fully walking in 4 weeks. And this cat lived 5 more years. We said goodbye to Sammy in her 20s. Another dog that was paralyzed, same thing. Owner thought couldn't do anything. He was a nurse. And he goes, we can't fix that in human medicine. 3 weeks.
Unbelievable.
Isn't that adorable? And I had to leave the audio on because she's just so happy to see her daddy.
What was the primary therapy that you found?
We did acupuncture, pulse electromagnetic frequencies, ozone, chiropractic work, laser. We threw the kitchen sink at her. But I mean, she was walking within a couple of days. You could see her getting up and fully walking in 3 weeks. Cancer, we see so much cancer. This cat had had this tumor removed 2 times before me, but they didn't treat the underlying cause. There is the eye. He actually was visual. And there he is at the 5-month mark on the right, and the cancer didn't return and he was visual.
Unbelievable.
This dog had a mast cell tumor. Just to show you the mast cell tumors, sometimes they're big black lesions, but very ulcerated spots. We used a oral product on this dog and he was fully resolved in 5 weeks. And he only relapsed if the owner took him off the medication.
Wow.
Diabetic animals, we see so many obese animals because they're eating processed foods. Sammy was diagnosed when he was 12 years of age. Blood sugar was 447 when we started. He started out as 27 pounds. In 9 months, he had lost a dog down to 15 pounds. And he was no longer insulin dependent. He was no longer a diabetic. Allergic skin disease, also one of the most common things that pet owners have to suffer with. And this dog had failed multiple veterinarians, multiple rounds of steroids, Apoquil, antibiotics. We biopsied it, got a clear diagnosis, treated her. And in 3 weeks, she was totally cleared up for the first time in her life, no longer itchy. And she lived a wonderful long life after that. Isn't that remarkable?
Amazing.
So that's what I have for you. I wanted to present a smattering of things that people could relate to, whether it's cancer or diabetes or skin diseases. There are so many things that show up as inflammation, but if we can just address the root cause of the disease, then we're able to fix the root cause of the disease in many cases, and the pets can go on to live whatever that normal lifespan is for them. So we don't make guarantees as to being able to fix everything. Obviously not. There's many other factors that play a role, but when we can show up and do our part, they have that ability to heal, and we do too. So I love using them as examples because it gives us the trust and faith that anything is possible at any stage. Because most of the cases I get, they've already failed traditional medicine at more than one doctor's office.
And what you're doing here is so, I mean, it's so parallels what I see, right? I mean, the people that I work with, they've been to many integrative physicians, they've been to chiropractors and acupuncturists and naturopaths. And it's not that any of those professions is bad in any way. What it tends to be is it's a failure to recognize the wide variety of therapies that we have at our disposal and changing the fundamental aspects that allow for health, right? And this is tricky, right? It's tricky with humans, it's tricky with pets. This is not easy stuff. But the fact that you're able to prove a model using a variety of therapies that, look, most doctors I know will laugh at. They'll think this doesn't work. It can't work. It's ridiculous. You know, there's no scientific basis for this stuff, right? And so, and I get it. I understand it. There's a fundamental aspect in me that wants to, that is kind of like prove it, right? Like I don't believe it until you prove it to me. But your case studies are excellent examples because it's not just a placebo effect. It's not just some story that you heard from somebody on the internet. These are actually, you're showing proof of case examples over and over again that not only one of these therapies can work, but a variety of them, particularly in conjunction, can be unbelievably effective.
Yeah, because they're all working on some phase of metabolism. So there really is a system to everything we do, and there has to be the lifestyle changes. You have to do a species appropriate diet. Those 6 principles, they have to happen. But now, when I first started doing this, there wasn't a lot of science. But now there is a plethora of science on ozone, on pulse electromagnetic frequencies, on laser therapies, on endo lasers. So now and hyperbaric oxygen, there's a plethora of stuff out there now. We just need to be willing to go look and willing to try it. And, a lot of people don't want to move their cheese. Remember the book, Don't Move My Cheese? Well, we have to move our cheese. And I think this time in our world is evident of the fact that whatever that old model was, it just isn't working any longer. And maybe we need to see the collapse of the old in order to be able to bring forward the new. And that's what I see people do. I see them starting to look at their life and their pet, because there's no coincidence that they have a particular pet in their life at this particular time with that particular challenge. Okay, so there's always a correlation to that, both energetically and emotionally. So as these people are starting to go, okay, what is it that I'm experiencing this for? And instead of being a victim, they choose to be empowered and take what they're experiencing and find the blessing in it. In the integrative world, we talk about cancer as the biggest blessing you can experience because it gives you the opportunity to wake up and change.
Yeah, and that's a big part of it, right? I think as we continue forward with this amazing technological development that is here now and will continue to move forward, there's a really important aspect that I really want to hammer home, both in this summit, I do in my book, and constantly in my messaging, that we've got to get the fundamentals right too. That we can't rely on these technologies to come and save us, right? They're not the savior that we're looking for. And so oftentimes that's what I see is, and again, look, I have this within me too, that I want something to just fix me. I don't want to do the work, like just do the work for me. And so I get the desire there. But these things really, really work magic when we get the fundamentals down, when we change our habits, right? And I know that you work with your pet owners in that same way. Like there's a reason that this pet developed the imbalances and the dis-eases that are showing up now. And so we've got to change those. And then we can provide these therapies that are adjuncts to a proper lifestyle, a proper diet that's going to facilitate health.
100%. So well said.
Beautiful. Well, Dr. Siegel, thank you so much for coming on and showing us these amazing case studies. Like I'm blown away every time I see them. I mean, particularly that one with the tumor on the eye. I mean, it's just so in your face, blatant. And the fact that you're able to get these pets their quality of life back, I mean, it just tugs at your heartstrings. And again, what's possible for them is possible for us. And so I'd love that we can use these as an example to pursue some of these therapies that we might not otherwise have considered, or we would consider fringe. And in fact, I think going forward, they're going to be so much more mainstream.
Well, thank you, Jason, for including me in your mission. We are like-minded, and I'm thrilled that we're able to bring more pet owners and more humans into our family circles so that we can really create the world that we came here to create. And we're doing it.
Beautifully said. Thanks so much for joining us.
Blessings, everybody.
Well, this concludes today's presentations, and I truly hope you enjoyed the fantastic information shared by the 5 speakers today. Be sure to tune in tomorrow because we have 5 more brilliant experts with cutting-edge information to help you accelerate healing and discover a greater depth of well-being. If you feel you might miss any of the upcoming interviews, I highly recommend you grab your all-access pass today at the limited time discounted price of just $67, so you can watch and rewatch at your leisure. All you have to do is click the button on this page to secure instant on-demand access to all 35 presentations and over $1,800 in bonuses. On behalf of the entire production crew, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow on the Ultimate Holistic Health Summit, latest breakthroughs you haven't heard of.